The Billionaire's Desperate Lie. Adrian Vale had $3 billion, half of Manhattan's skyline, and exactly 7 seconds before his ex-girlfriend reached him across the ballroom floor. That's when a stranger in a wrinkled dress grabbed his arm and whispered the words that would destroy everything he thought he knew about control. "Please pretend you know me." He should have walked away. He should have said no. Instead, he lied. And that single moment of weakness would cost him his carefully built walls, his emotional distance, and possibly his heart. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. Adrian Vale stood at the edge of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, nursing a whiskey he hadn't actually tasted in 20 minutes, watching Manhattan's elite celebrate a wedding he had no business attending. The crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors, making everyone look like they were moving through expensive fog. He checked his watch, 8:47 p.m. His son's babysitter had him until 11. That gave Adrian exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes to make an appearance, shake the groom's hand, and disappear before anyone cornered him about investments, mergers, or whatever the hell rich people talked about when they ran out of weather to discuss. "You look thrilled to be here," someone had said earlier. "A woman in diamonds that probably costs more than most people's houses." "Thrilled," Adrian had replied, the lie sitting easy on his tongue after years of practice. He wasn't thrilled. He was tired. Tired in the specific way that money couldn't fix, the kind that lived in his chest and made every interaction feel like he was watching himself from somewhere outside his body. He'd built Vale Industries from his father's crumbling legacy into something that mattered, something that employed 6,000 people and generated enough revenue to make financial newspapers print his name in bold. And yet here he stood, surrounded by hundreds of people, feeling like the loneliest man in New York. The wedding was for Marcus Chen, a college roommate who'd stayed in touch despite Adrian's tendency to ghost for months at a time. Marcus deserved better, probably. Deserved a best man who actually believed in the ceremony, who didn't look at the bride's white dress and think about divorce statistics and prenuptial agreements. But Marcus had insisted Adrian come, had said it with that specific kind of earnestness that made refusing feel cruel, so here he was. Black Tom Ford suit, silver cufflinks his son had picked out that morning, and a smile that felt painted on. "Daddy, you look like a penguin," Oliver had said, 6 years old and brutally honest. "Thanks, buddy. Penguins are dignified. Penguins are birds that can't fly." Adrian had laughed at that, actually laughed, which was more genuine emotion than he'd managed in weeks. Oliver had that effect, cutting through bullshit with the kind of clarity only children possessed. His son was staying with Maria tonight, their longtime nanny who'd become more family than employee. She'd waved them off from the apartment doorway, Oliver already in pajamas patterned with cartoon rockets, and Adrian had felt the familiar ache of leaving him behind, even for a few hours, even for something as normal as a wedding. The ballroom swirled with motion. Couples danced to something classical and forgettable. Waitstaff moved like synchronized swimmers through the crowd. Someone laughed too loud near the dessert table. Adrian took another fake sip of whiskey and wondered if anyone would notice if he just left now. Obligations be damned. That's when he saw her. Not the stranger, not yet. First, he saw his ex-girlfriend, Vanessa Carmichael, cutting through the crowd with the precision of a shark who'd spotted blood in the water. She wore crimson, which seemed unnecessarily symbolic, and her smile was the same one she'd worn when she'd told him that dating a widower with a kid wasn't what she'd signed up for. That had been 18 months ago. He hadn't missed her for 17 of them. Adrian's jaw tightened. He looked for exits, ballroom doors blocked by a wedding party photo session, terrace doors hidden behind a wall of guests, bathroom too obvious. Vanessa was 30 feet away now, 25, moving with the kind of purpose that meant she wanted something. An introduction to a business contact, maybe. Or closure, which was worse. People always wanted closure, as if pain could be sealed up neat like a FedEx package. "Adrian!" Her voice carried over the music. 20 feet now. He turned instinctively, looking for anywhere else to be, and that's when he saw the woman in the navy dress. She stood near the bar, looking like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. Her dress was nice enough, simple, fitted, navy blue that had probably seemed appropriate when she'd put it on, but it had a small stain near the hem that suggested a hasty subway ride, or a spilled coffee, or a life lived without the luxury of backup outfits. Her hair was dark, pulled into something that might have started as an elegant twist, but was now slowly surrendering to gravity. She kept tugging at her earrings like they were borrowed and didn't quite fit. What caught Adrian's attention wasn't her appearance. It was her expression. She was scanning the room with the specific look of someone searching for an exit strategy, and he recognized it immediately because he'd been wearing the same face all night. 15 feet. Vanessa was 15 feet away now, and her smile had sharpened. The woman in navy caught his eye, just for a second, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Not of each other, but of the situation. Two people drowning in the same expensive party, looking for lifeboats. Adrian made a decision. Possibly stupid, definitely impulsive. He walked straight toward the stranger. She saw him coming and her eyes widened slightly, a flash of panic crossing her features like she thought she'd done something wrong just by existing in his sightline. But before either of them could speak, before he could even think through what he was doing, Vanessa's voice cut through the space between them. "Adrian, there you are. I've been looking everywhere." The woman in navy did something unexpected. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Adrian, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Please pretend you know me." Her eyes were green. That was his first coherent thought. His second was that she looked terrified, not of him specifically, but of the room, the moment, the weight of whatever had driven her to ask a complete stranger for help. Adrian didn't hesitate. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him to commit to a decision the second you made it. Consequences be damned. He smiled, genuinely this time, and said loud enough for Vanessa to hear, "There you are. I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." The relief that flooded the woman's face was immediate and overwhelming. She played along, nervousness obvious but trying. "The bathroom line was insane. You know how these things are." "Unfortunately, I do." Adrian turned to face Vanessa, who had stopped 3 feet away, her expression shifting from predatory to confused. "Vanessa, good to see you." "Adrian." Vanessa's eyes moved between him and the stranger, recalculating. "I didn't know you were bringing someone." "Last-minute decision," Adrian said smoothly. The lie came easy, easier than it should have. "This is—" He realized he had no idea what the woman's name was. The woman caught his pause and extended her hand to Vanessa without missing a beat. "Clara Bennett. Vanessa Carmichael." The handshake was brief, territorial. "How do you two know each other?" Clara opened her mouth, clearly scrambling, but Adrian cut in. "We met at a gallery opening last month. Couldn't stop talking about the terrible installation pieces, and apparently that's a solid foundation for friendship." Clara nodded a little too enthusiastically. "The one with the suspended shopping carts? Awful." "Pretentious garbage," Adrian agreed, having no memory of any such exhibit but willing to commit to the bit. Vanessa's smile had frozen in place, the kind of expression that meant she was deciding whether to push further or retreat. Adrian watched her calculate the angles, saw the moment she decided this wasn't worth the effort. "Well, it's good to see you happy, Adrian. Enjoy the wedding." She left with her dignity mostly intact, disappearing back into the crowd like a crimson shark looking for easier prey. The silence that followed felt loud despite the music and conversation flowing around them. Adrian turned to look at Clara properly for the first time. Up close, she was prettier than he'd initially registered, not in the polished, expensive way Vanessa had been pretty, but in a way that seemed more real. Tired eyes that had smile lines at the corners, a mouth that looked like it spent more time frowning in concentration than smiling for cameras. A small scar on her chin that suggested a story. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. Her hands were shaking slightly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in that position." "What position?" "Rescuing a damsel in distress from a terrible party? I'm basically a knight now." A startled laugh escaped her. "Knights probably don't usually show up in suits that cost more than my rent." "You'd be surprised. Armor is expensive." Adrian gestured toward the terrace doors, which had cleared slightly. "Want to get some air before someone else tries to make small talk about the weather or asks if I'm single?" Clara hesitated, and he saw her trying to figure out if he was serious, if this was some kind of game rich people played. "You don't have to. I mean, you helped already. I can disappear now." "I wasn't kidding about the air," Adrian said. This room is suffocating, and I've been looking for an excuse to leave it for the past hour. You'd actually be doing me a favor." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay. Yes, air sounds good." They moved through the crowd together, navigating around clusters of guests and wandering waitstaff. Someone called Adrian's name, but he pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the physics of getting himself and this stranger to somewhere quieter without causing a scene. The terrace doors opened onto a rooftop garden that the plaza had somehow maintained despite being in the middle of Manhattan. String lights hung between potted trees, and the night air carried the faint smell of exhaust, mixed with expensive perfume, from inside. There were a few other people scattered around, smokers mostly, huddled near the far railing, but the corner near a decorative fountain was empty. Clara walked toward it like she was being pulled by gravity, stopping at the railing and breathing deep. "Better?" Adrian asked, keeping a respectful distance. "So much better." She turned to face him, and her expression had shifted from panic to something like embarrassment. "I should probably explain why I just ambushed you in there. You don't owe me an explanation." "I kind of do, though. You saved me from—" She paused, seeming to search for words. "Okay, this is going to sound stupid. Most honest things do." That got another small laugh. Clara leaned against the railing, her shoulders dropping from their defensive hunch. "I came here tonight because my college roommate is the bride's cousin, and she guilt-tripped me into attending. Bought me the dress, paid for my cab, the whole thing, and I showed up because I thought maybe it would be nice to feel normal for once, you know? Wear a fancy dress, drink champagne I didn't pay for, pretend I belong somewhere other than behind a coffee counter. You work at a cafe? In Brooklyn, Prospect Heights. I make lattes for people who treat me like I'm furniture, and I smile because I need the tips." She said it matter-of-factly without self-pity, which Adrian found more affecting than if she'd tried to make it sound noble. "Anyway, I got here and immediately realized I'd made a mistake. Everyone knows everyone, and I'm just this random person in a borrowed dress trying not to spill anything on myself. My roommate disappeared the second we arrived. She actually knows people here, and I've been standing near various pieces of furniture for the past hour trying to look busy." The universal strategy of awkward people everywhere. Exactly. And then I saw this couple I used to know in college heading toward me, and Clara made a gesture like something exploding. "I panicked. They're the type of people who ask what you're doing with your life now, and they genuinely want to know, which somehow makes it worse because then you have to admit you're doing nothing interesting at all." Adrian considered this. "So you grabbed the nearest stranger and begged for help?" The nearest stranger who looked like he might be miserable enough to understand. She met his eyes, and there was something sharp in her gaze now, assessing. "You were wearing the same expression I was, like you'd rather be literally anywhere else. Was I that obvious?" "Only to someone else looking for the exits." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. The music from inside filtered through the glass doors, something slow and romantic that probably cost a fortune to license. Adrian watched Clara's profile as she stared out at the Manhattan skyline, the lights of buildings reflecting in her eyes like fallen stars. "I'm Adrian, by the way," he said, since we skipped formal introductions. "I know who you are." Clara said it without inflection, just a statement of fact. Something cold settled in Adrian's chest. "You do. Your picture was in the Times last week. Something about a merger with a European tech company." She turned to look at him fully. "I read it while eating my sad desk lunch. You were standing in front of some very impressive building looking very serious." "That's my default setting. Serious in front of impressive buildings. It's a good look for you." There was no flirtation in her voice, just observation. "Must be exhausting, though, always being Adrian Vale, billionaire businessman instead of just Adrian." No one had said anything like that to him in years. Maybe ever. Adrian felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he hadn't known he was wearing. "You have no idea." "I might, actually. Different tax bracket, same feeling. I spend so much time being Clara the cafe worker that I forget there's supposed to be more to me than someone who knows how to properly foam milk." "Is there more?" She smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her all night. "I'd like to think so. I write sometimes. Stories mostly. Nothing published, nothing good enough for that yet. But it's mine. The one thing in my life that doesn't belong to someone else's schedule or expectations. What kind of stories? The kind where people are messy and complicated and don't have their shit together, mostly. I'm not interested in perfect characters or neat endings. Real life doesn't work like that. No, Adrian agreed quietly. It really doesn't. Someone burst through the terrace doors, a drunk groomsman laughing too loud, and the spell between them broke slightly. Clara checked her phone, grimaced. I should probably go back in, make an appearance for at least one more hour before I can escape without seeming rude. Or, Adrian said, surprising himself, we could leave entirely. Clara raised an eyebrow. Leave the wedding we barely attended? I've said hello to the groom. You fulfilled your obligation to your roommate by showing up. We've both been miserable enough for one evening. He pulled out his phone. There's a bookstore in the West Village that stays open until midnight. They have a cafe in the back that serves coffee that isn't trying to be art. We could go there. Talk about messy, complicated characters who don't have their shit together. It was impulsive, possibly inappropriate. Adrian had a son waiting at home, a schedule that barely allowed for spontaneity, and absolutely no business inviting a woman he'd just met to extend an evening that was supposed to end in polite escape. But Clara was looking at him like he'd just suggested something revolutionary instead of mildly irresponsible, and he realized he wanted to know what she'd say more than he'd wanted anything in recent memory. A bookstore, Clara repeated slowly. At night. With a stranger I just met. A stranger who saved you from awkward small talk with college acquaintances. I feel like that earned some trust. That's exactly what a serial killer would say. Serial killers probably don't invite their victims to public bookstores where there are witnesses and security cameras. Clara laughed, a real laugh this time that seemed to surprise her. Okay, yes, let's go to the bookstore. They left through a side exit, avoiding the main ballroom entirely. Adrian texted Marcus a brief apology that he'd try to explain later, though he had no idea what the explanation would actually be. The night air hit them properly once they were on the street, cool enough to feel good against skin that had been trapped in temperature-controlled luxury. Should we take your car? Clara asked, looking around like she expected a limousine to materialize. I don't have a car here. I took the subway. She stared at him. You took the subway. To a Plaza Hotel wedding. It's faster than traffic, and I don't need a driver to feel important. Adrian started walking toward the nearest station. Is that weird? It's the least billionaire thing I've ever heard. I'm full of surprises. They walked together through Manhattan at night, the city alive with the specific energy that only happened after dark. Adrian couldn't remember the last time he'd done something like this. Spontaneous, unplanned, with someone who didn't want anything from him except conversation. Clara kept pace beside him easily, her heels clicking on pavement in a rhythm that felt oddly companionable. The bookstore was called Volumes, and it existed in that perfect space between organized and chaotic. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, narrow aisles that smelled like paper and coffee, mismatched furniture that invited you to sit and stay a while. The cafe in the back was exactly as Adrian had described. Small, understated, run by someone who cared more about good coffee than Instagram aesthetics. They ordered. Adrian got black coffee. Clara got something with caramel and extra foam, then immediately looked embarrassed about it. What? She said, defensive. Nothing. It's perfect. Very person who makes coffee for a living orders the most complicated drink possible. I'm allowed to enjoy sugar. It's been a long week. They found a corner with 2 armchairs that had seen better days, positioned near a shelf of poetry that probably no one ever bought. Adrian sank into his chair and felt something in his spine relax that had been tense for months, maybe years. So, Clara said, wrapping both hands around her cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. Do you do this often? Rescue strange women and take them to bookstores? Never. This is a first. I'm honored or concerned. Haven't decided which yet. Both is fair. Adrian took a sip of coffee. Found it actually good. Can I ask you something? Depends on the question. Why did you really come to that wedding tonight? Clara was quiet for a long moment, considering. When she spoke, her voice was softer. Because I'm 30 years old and I work 60 hours a week at a cafe while trying to convince myself I'm actually a writer. Because my roommate has a life that looks like what I thought mine would look like by now. Friends, connections, invitations to places where she belongs. And I thought maybe if I showed up, If I pretended hard enough, some of that would rub off on me. She laughed, but it sounded hollow. Stupid, right? Not stupid. Human. What about you? Why were you there looking like you wanted to be anywhere else? Adrian thought about lying, about giving her the easy answer about obligations and friendship, but something about the way Clara had offered her truth made him want to match it with his own. Because I'm 32 years old and I have more money than I know what to do with, a company that runs itself, and a son I'm terrified I'm failing every single day. Because everyone assumes that success means happiness, and I don't know how to tell them it mostly just means being really good at looking fine while falling apart. He met her eyes. I went to that wedding because my friend asked me to, and saying yes to normal things is supposed to make me feel normal. It doesn't work, but I keep trying anyway. Clara set down her coffee cup carefully. You have a son. Oliver, he's 6. Obsessed with space, terrible at sitting still. The best thing that ever happened to me. What about his mom? The question hung in the air between them. Adrian could have deflected, changed subjects, but Clara's expression held nothing but genuine curiosity. No judgment, no ulterior motive. She died, Adrian said quietly. 4 years ago. Car accident. Sudden, senseless, the kind of thing that reminds you how little control you actually have over anything that matters. I'm sorry. Thank you. He meant it. People usually said they were sorry and then immediately tried to fix the sadness, to move past it. Clara just let the words sit, respectful of their weight. They talked for hours. About Oliver's obsession with astronauts, and Clara's dream of writing a novel that mattered. About the cafe where she worked, and the customers who treated her like she was invisible. About Adrian's company, and the constant pressure to make decisions that affected thousands of lives. About Brooklyn versus Manhattan. About books they'd loved and movies they'd hated. About the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't really see you. Clara told him about growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, about moving to New York with dreams so big they'd barely fit in her childhood bedroom, about the slow realization that the city didn't care about dreams unless you had the money to fund them, about working 3 jobs during her 20s, about the stories she wrote late at night that never seemed good enough to share, about the way disappointment became just another part of her routine. Adrian told her about inheriting Vail Industries at 25 when his father died, about the scramble to prove he deserved it, about building something that mattered while losing sight of why it mattered in the first place, about meeting Oliver's mother at a charity gala, about the brief perfect years when he'd thought he'd figured out how to balance everything, about the phone call that had ended that illusion permanently, about raising a son alone while running an empire, about the guilt of never being enough for either. The bookstore owner eventually approached their corner, apologetic. Hey folks, we're closing in 10 minutes. Adrian checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. They'd been talking for almost 3 hours. We should go, Clara said, but she didn't move. We should, Adrian agreed, also not moving. They walked out together into a Manhattan that had shifted into its late-night mode, quieter, darker, more honest somehow. Clara pulled out her phone to call a rideshare. Let me get you a car, Adrian said. I can pay for my own ride home. I know you can, but I'd like to do something nice, and you've already made it clear you're not interested in being impressed by money, so let me have this small victory. Clara smiled despite herself. Fine, but only because my feet hurt and I'm too tired to argue. Adrian arranged for a car through his usual service, not a limo, just a nice sedan with a driver who knew to be quiet. It arrived within minutes. He opened the door for Clara, who rolled her eyes at the gesture but didn't protest. Thank you, she said, one foot in the car, one still on the pavement. For tonight, for the rescue, the bookstore, the conversation, all of it. Thank you for making a terrible evening into something I'll actually remember. We should probably not do this again, Clara said, and there was real regret in her voice. Your life and mine don't exactly overlap, and I'm not interested in being someone's brief experiment in slumming it with normal people. Adrian felt something twist in his chest. Is that what you think this was? I don't know what this was, but I know how stories like this usually end, and I'm trying to be smart. She met his eyes. Good night, Adrian. Good night, Clara. The car pulled away, taillights disappearing into traffic. Adrian stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the space where she'd been. feeling like he'd just lost something he hadn't known he was looking for. His phone buzzed, a text from Maria. Oliver asleep. All good here? How was the wedding? Adrian typed back. Interesting. Be home soon. He started walking toward his own apartment, 30 blocks uptown, not ready to get in a car yet. The night air helped him think. His mind kept returning to Clara's face in the bookstore, the way she'd laughed when he'd made a terrible joke about poetry, the casual honesty with which she'd described her life without apology or embellishment. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He almost didn't check it, but curiosity won. This is Clara. I stole your number from the car service receipt because apparently I'm terrible at being smart. The cafe where I work is called Corner Grind in Prospect Heights. If you ever want mediocre coffee made by someone who's probably going to spill it, I'm there most mornings. No pressure. Just information. Adrian stopped walking. Read the message 3 times. Smiled despite himself. He typed back, "What time do you open?" The response came quickly, 7 a.m., but I'm more coherent after 9. See you at 9 tomorrow then. I'll try not to order anything too complicated. You better not. I have a reputation to maintain. Adrian pocketed his phone and continued walking home, feeling lighter than he had in years. The city stretched out around him, full of possibility and noise and the specific magic that only happened when you stopped trying to control everything and just let life surprise you. Tomorrow he'd wake up early, get Oliver ready for the day, rearrange meetings he probably shouldn't rearrange, and show up at a cafe in Brooklyn to see a woman who'd grabbed his arm in a moment of panic and somehow cracked open something he'd thought was permanently sealed. He had no idea what happened next. For once, that felt like exactly the right place to be. Adrian arrived at Corner Grind at 9:03 a.m., which felt like a reasonable amount of late. Not so punctual it seemed desperate. Not so tardy it suggested he didn't care. The cafe occupied a corner spot in Prospect Heights that looked like it had been there forever, wedged between a dry cleaner and a bodega with produce stacked outside in wooden crates. The windows were fogged with steam, and through them he could see the blurred shapes of people hunched over laptops and coffee cups. He pushed through the door and was hit immediately with the smell of espresso and something baking that made his stomach remind him he'd skipped breakfast. The interior was exactly what he'd expected. Mismatched furniture, local art on the walls that was trying very hard, a chalkboard menu with handwriting that suggested someone had given up halfway through and just scrawled "Ask us" for half the items. Clara stood behind the counter, hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a black apron covered in what looked like the evidence of a morning's worth of accidents. She was making a drink for someone, her hands moving through the motions with the kind of automatic precision that came from repetition. When she looked up and saw him, something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, or regret that she'd actually given him her number. "You came," she said. "You sound shocked." "I am, a little. Thought maybe you'd wake up this morning and realize coming to Brooklyn for mediocre coffee was a terrible idea." "I've had worse ideas." Adrian stepped up to the counter, aware of the line forming behind him. "What do you recommend?" "The drip coffee is actually decent today. Everything else is a gamble depending on whether I'm paying attention." "I'll risk it, whatever you think I'd like." Clara raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She turned to her espresso machine and Adrian watched her work. The practiced movements, the slight frown of concentration, the way she checked the shot timing like it actually mattered. 2 minutes later, she slid a cup across the counter toward him. "Americano, 2 shots. No sugar because you seem like the kind of person who drinks coffee to punish yourself, not enjoy it." Adrian took a sip. It was good. Better than good, actually. "You're dangerously perceptive." "I make coffee for a living. You learn to read people, or you make the wrong drink 100 times a day." She glanced at the growing line behind him. "You should probably move before these people murder both of us." He paid, left a tip that was probably too generous but not so excessive it would embarrass her, and found a small table near the window that wobbled when he set his cup down. The cafe was busy with the morning rush, people in business, casual, grabbing drinks before work, freelancers setting up laptops for the long haul, a woman with a stroller trying to navigate the narrow space between tables. Adrian felt conspicuous in his suit, like he'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood, and everyone could tell. Clara worked the counter with another barista, a guy with a beard and multiple tattoos, who seemed to communicate with her primarily through grunts and head nods. They moved around each other with the efficiency of people who'd worked together long enough to develop a system. Adrian watched her take orders, make drinks, handle the register, wipe down the counter, all while maintaining a customer service smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The rush died down around 10. Clara said something to the bearded barista, untied her apron, and grabbed 2 pastries from the case before making her way to Adrian's table. "Break time," she said, sitting down across from him. 15 minutes before the next wave hits. Want a croissant? They're day old, but still decent. Sure. Adrian accepted the pastry, which was flaky and buttery and definitely not day old. You lied about these being old. I did, but if I tell customers they're fresh, they complain about the price. If I say they're day old, they feel like they're getting a deal. Clara tore off a piece of her own croissant. Welcome to the economics of guilt-based sales. Smart. Necessary. She studied him for a moment. You look different without the wedding pressure, more human. I feel different. Oliver woke me up at 6 by jumping on my bed and demanding I explain why stars don't fall down. What did you tell him? That gravity works in mysterious ways and we should both go back to sleep. He wasn't impressed. Clara smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. You're a terrible astrophysicist. The worst. But he's already moved on to wanting to know if astronauts can bring their pets to space, so I think I'm off the hook. Adrian sipped his coffee. Do you do this every morning? The rush, the customer service, the pretending day-old pastries are fresh? 6 days a week. Sundays I sleep until noon and pretend I'm going to write something brilliant. Then I watch bad television and feel guilty instead. That sounds awful. It is. But rent in this city doesn't pay itself, and this job has health insurance, which is apparently something adults are supposed to care about. She paused. Why are you really here, Adrian? And don't say the coffee, because you can afford much better coffee than this. He considered lying, or deflecting, or making a joke that would let them both pretend this was casual. Instead, he said, because last night was the first time in years I've talked to someone who didn't want anything from me. And I woke up this morning and realized I wasn't ready for that to be over. Clara looked away toward the window, watching people pass on the sidewalk outside. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone you just met. I know, I'm sorry. I can leave if... I didn't say I wanted you to leave. She turned back to him. I said it's pressure. There's a difference. They sat in silence for a moment, the cafe noise filling the space between them, the hiss of the espresso machine, conversations from other tables, someone's phone playing music too loud before they remembered to use headphones. Can I ask you something? Clara said finally. Sure. What do you actually do? Like, I know you run some big company, but what does that mean on a daily basis? Adrian laughed despite himself. That's the question everyone should ask, but nobody does. Usually people just assume it's impressive and move on. He thought about how to explain it. Vail Industries started as a real estate development company my grandfather built in the 50s. My father expanded it into construction, then urban planning, then smart city technology. When I took over, I shifted focus towards sustainable development and green infrastructure. We build things, apartment complexes with solar panels, public transportation hubs that actually work, water treatment facilities that don't poison people, boring stuff that matters. That doesn't sound boring. It is when you spend most of your time in meetings arguing about zoning regulations and profit margins. The actual building part, the part that matters, I barely see anymore. I just sign off on designs other people create and hope they don't cut corners to save money. Do they? Cut corners? Sometimes. That's why I'm paranoid about oversight. He finished his croissant, brushed crumbs from his hands. What about you? You said you write. What kind of stories? Claire's expression shifted, became guarded. Nothing you'd want to read. Try me. They're, I don't know, character studies mostly. People in bad situations making questionable choices. No heroes, no neat resolutions, just humans being messy and trying to survive. She picked at her croissant. I had a creative writing professor in college who told me I was too cynical to write anything people would actually want to read. That stories need hope to matter. Your professor sounds like an asshole. She was, actually, but she might have been right. I've been trying to write a novel for 3 years, and I keep starting over because nothing feels honest enough. Maybe honest is more important than hopeful. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just afraid to finish something because then I'd have to admit it's not as good as I want it to be. Clara checked her phone. Break's almost over. I should get back. Can I see you again? Adrian asked before she could stand up. Not here. Somewhere that's not your workplace where you have to be polite to me. Why? Because I want to. Because talking to you doesn't feel like work. Because... He stopped, realizing how this might sound. I'm not trying to rescue you or fix your life or whatever rich guy fantasy you're worried about. I just like your company. Clara studied his face like she was looking for the trap. I get off work at 4 today. There's a bookstore in Park Slope I go to sometimes when I need to remember why I moved to this city. If you happen to be there around 5, we could talk more. Or not. Your choice. I'll be there. We'll see. She stood, grabbed their empty cups. Thanks for coming, Adrian, even if this is a terrible idea. Especially if it's a terrible idea. She smiled despite herself and disappeared back behind the counter. Adrian left before the next rush started, walking back toward the subway with his head full of thoughts he couldn't quite organize. He had meetings scheduled all afternoon, budget reviews, a conference call with investors in Singapore, something about a delayed project in Brooklyn that his operations manager kept flagging as urgent. Normal life, pulling him back toward responsibility. He made it to his office by 11, fielding questions from his assistant about scheduling conflicts and whether he was still planning to attend a gala next month. His desk was covered in papers that needed signatures, decisions that needed to be made, problems that wouldn't solve themselves. Adrian settled into his chair and tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to Clara's hands moving through coffee routines, the tired honesty in her voice when she'd talked about her writing. Mr. Vale? His assistant Jennifer stood in the doorway. The Singapore call is ready. Right, thanks. He straightened his tie, pulled up the relevant files on his computer, and slipped back into the version of himself that made decisions affecting millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. The call lasted 90 minutes and resolved nothing except to schedule another call next week. After that came the budget review, which revealed that 3 projects were running over cost and 2 were behind schedule. His operations manager, David, presented solutions that mostly involved cutting corners Adrian wasn't comfortable cutting. We can't compromise on the air filtration systems, Adrian said, interrupting David's presentation. That's the whole point of this building, providing affordable housing that doesn't make people sick. I understand, but we're already 20% over budget, and find the money somewhere else. Cut my consulting fee if you have to, but we're not cheaping out on something that affects people's health. David made a note, clearly frustrated but smart enough not to argue. The meeting continued with similar tension, Adrian pushing back on every suggestion that prioritized profit over quality. By the time it ended, he had a headache forming behind his eyes, and a growing certainty that everyone in the room thought he was being unrealistic. Maybe he was. Maybe caring about air quality in low-income housing was naive when investors wanted returns, and construction companies wanted bonuses. But if he didn't fight for it, nobody would, and the whole thing would just become another building that looked good in press releases while slowly failing the people who lived there. He checked his watch. 3:47 p.m. If he left now, he could pick up Oliver from school, spend an hour with him, and still make it to Park Slope by 5. It would require canceling a call with the mayor's office about permits, but that call had been rescheduled 3 times already. What was once more? Adrian gathered his things, told Jennifer he was working from home the rest of the day, and made it to Oliver's school just as kids started streaming out. His son spotted him immediately and ran over with the kind of full-body enthusiasm that 6-year-olds specialized in. "Daddy, you're here! You're never here!" "I'm here sometimes." "Not usually." "Usually it's Maria." Oliver grabbed his hand, already talking a mile a minute about something that happened at recess involving a soccer ball and a kid named Marcus who apparently didn't know the rules. Adrian listened, asked the right questions, felt the familiar guilt of not being present enough, warring with the reality that someone had to run the company that paid for this school. They stopped for ice cream on the way home, Oliver's choice. Chocolate with rainbow sprinkles, which he wore more than he ate. Maria met them at the apartment, ready to take over for the evening. Oliver protested briefly but was distracted by the promise of a new space documentary she'd found. "You look tired," Maria said to Adrian once Oliver was settled with his ice cream in front of the television. "Long day." "You say that every day." She gave him the look that meant she saw through whatever excuse he was about to make. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because you had to? I'm about to do that now, actually. Maria raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Probably, but I'm doing it anyway. The bookstore in Park Slope was called Narrative, and it occupied 2 floors of a brownstone that looked like it might collapse if you leaned on it wrong. Adrian found it at 4:58, which meant he'd timed this exactly right or was slightly desperate. Both could be true. He pushed through the door and was greeted by the smell of old paper and coffee from a small cafe area near the back. Clara sat in an armchair near the poetry section, reading something she was clearly absorbed in. She'd changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a sweater that looked soft and well-worn. Her hair was down now, falling past her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, less guarded. Adrian approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. Good book? She looked up, and her expression shifted through several emotions before landing on something like relief. You actually came. You sound surprised. Again. I am. Again. She closed the book, marked her place with a receipt she pulled from her pocket. I half convinced myself you'd come to your senses and realize slumming it in Brooklyn bookstores wasn't worth your time. You keep saying that, slumming it, like spending time with you is charity work. Adrian sat in the chair across from hers. I don't think you understand how exhausting it is to spend every day with people who only care about what you can do for them. You don't want anything from me. That's rare enough to be valuable. Everyone wants something, Adrian. I'm just better at hiding it than most. What do you want, then? Clara considered this, her fingers tracing the edge of her book. To feel like my life is going somewhere instead of just happening to me. To write something that matters. To wake up without immediately calculating how many hours I have to work before I can sleep again. She met his eyes. Small stuff. Impossible stuff. Not impossible. Spoken like someone who's never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. It wasn't said cruelly, just factually, but it landed hard anyway. Adrian thought about his apartment, about Oliver's private school, about the casual way he'd offered to pay for Clara's car the night before without even thinking about the cost. The distance between their lives felt suddenly enormous. You're right, he said. I don't know what that's like, but that doesn't mean I can't understand that it's hard. Understanding and experiencing are different things. I know. I'm not trying to pretend otherwise. He leaned forward. Can I tell you something? Sure. I'm terrified every single day that I'm failing Oliver, that he's going to grow up and realize his dad was so busy building things and making money that he forgot to actually be present, that success and being a good father are mutually exclusive, and I chose wrong. The words came out faster than he intended. Everyone sees the money and the company and assumes I have everything figured out. But I don't. I'm improvising constantly and hoping nobody notices. Clara was quiet for a long moment. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in months. Your turn. Tell me something honest. I'm scared I'm never going to be good enough. At writing, at life, at anything that matters. That I'm going to wake up at 40, still making coffee for people who don't see me, still telling myself I'm a writer, even though I've never finished anything worth reading. She looked away. I came to New York because I thought talent mattered more than money. Turns out that was naive. Or maybe you just haven't found the right opportunity yet. That's what people say when they're trying to be nice about failure. Adrian wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he suspected that would just prove her point about him not understanding. Instead, he said, "Show me something you've written." Clara's eyes widened. What? You said you write. Show me. I want to read it. No, absolutely not. Why not? Because it's not ready. It's rough and probably terrible, and you're afraid I'll confirm what you already suspect about it not being good enough. Adrian kept his voice gentle. I get that, but you can't spend your whole life protecting yourself from disappointment. Watch me. But she was smiling slightly when she said it, and Adrian knew he'd won something small. They spent the next 2 hours wandering the bookstore, pulling books from shelves and reading passages aloud to each other, arguing about poetry and whether literary fiction was pretentious or profound. Clara had opinions, strong ones, about everything from magical realism to the Oxford comma, and watching her defend her positions with the kind of passion she clearly couldn't bring to her cafe job made Adrian realize just how much of herself she kept hidden during normal life. They ended up at the cafe section. sharing a pot of tea that Clara insisted was overpriced but ordered anyway. The conversation drifted from books to movies to the specific kind of loneliness that came from living in a city full of millions of people who didn't know you existed. "Do you ever feel like you're performing?" Clara asked. "Like there's the version of you that goes through the motions every day, and then there's the real you watching from somewhere else, wondering when you get to stop pretending." "Every single day," Adrian admitted, "especially at work. I sit in meetings and make decisions and sign documents, and the whole time there's this voice in my head asking if any of it actually matters." "Does it?" "Some of it. The housing projects, the infrastructure improvements, that stuff matters. But the rest? The networking events, the investor calls, the constant posturing?" He shook his head. "I'd give it all up if I could figure out how to do the meaningful parts without the rest." "Why don't you?" "Because they're connected. You can't have the impact without the money, and you can't have the money without playing the game. It's a trap that pays well." Clara poured more tea, watching the steam rise from her cup. "I used to think success would fix everything, that if I could just get published, or recognized, or validated somehow, I'd finally feel like I'd made the right choices. But the more time passes, the more I realize success doesn't fix being lonely. It just makes you lonely in a nicer apartment. Or a lonelier one." "Exactly." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "We're both pretty pathetic, aren't we?" "Completely. It's kind of comforting." They stayed until the bookstore staff started giving them pointed looks about closing time. Outside, the evening had shifted into full dark, streetlights making golden pools on the sidewalk. Clara pulled her jacket tighter against the cold. "Thank you for this," she said. "For showing up, for listening, for not making me feel crazy about all my neuroses." "Thank you for the same." Adrian hesitated. "Can I walk you home?" "That's very gentlemanly of you, but I live in the opposite direction from the subway you need." "I don't care about the direction." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but it's a walk. I'm in Crown Heights." They walked together through Brooklyn at night, the neighborhood shifting around them, Park Slope's brownstones giving way to more commercial strips, then residential blocks where trees grew through cracks in the sidewalk, and people sat on stoops despite the cold. Clara pointed out landmarks that mattered to her: the bodega that sold the best coffee at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep, the community garden where she sometimes sat to write, the laundromat where she'd once witnessed a proposal that ended in a fight. "You love this city," Adrian observed. "I hate this city," Clara corrected, "but I also can't imagine living anywhere else. It's complicated." "Everything interesting is." They reached her building, a walk-up in Crown Heights that had definitely seen better decades. Clara stopped at the entrance, fishing for her keys. "This is me. 5th floor, no elevator, radiator that sounds like someone's murdering a robot every morning at 6. "Sounds charming." "It's a disaster, but it's mine." She found her keys, then turned to face him fully. "Adrian, I need to say something." "Okay. This, whatever this is, it can't be what you probably think it is. I'm not interested in being saved by some wealthy guy who thinks I'm a project. And I'm definitely not interested in being someone you date until you get bored and go back to your real life. I don't think you're a project. Not yet. But it's easy to romanticize struggle when you're not living it. A month from now, you'll realize that dating someone who lives in a 5th floor walk-up and smells like coffee beans isn't actually as charming as it seems right now." Adrian stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she'd have to look up to meet his eyes. "You keep telling me what I'm going to think or feel, but you don't actually know me well enough to make those predictions." "I know your type." "My type. Rich guys who get bored with their lives and decide slumming it with regular people will make them feel authentic. Then reality sets in and they remember why they stayed in their own lane to begin with." "You're terrified," Adrian said quietly. "That's what this is. You're scared that if you let yourself believe this might be real, it'll hurt worse when it ends." Clara's jaw tightened. "And you're arrogant enough to think you're different from every other wealthy man who thought he could cross class lines without consequences." "Maybe I am arrogant, but I'm also here, at your building in Crown Heights at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, having walked 40 blocks because I wanted to spend more time with you. That has to count for something." They stared at each other, tension crackling in the space between them. Finally, Clara said, "Come inside." "What?" "Come inside. See where I actually live. See the reality of my life instead of the romanticized version you've built in your head." Then decide if you still want to do this. Adrian followed her up 5 flights of stairs that smelled like someone's cooking and possibly mildew. Clara's apartment was exactly what he'd expected: tiny, cluttered, filled with books and papers and evidence of a life lived in the margins of someone else's schedule. But it was also warm, personal, completely hers in a way his expensive apartment had never felt his. "This is it," Clara said, arms spread in presentation. 300 square feet of reality. Still interested? Adrian looked around at the makeshift desk by the window, the laptop covered in stickers, the walls lined with shelves made from boards and cinder blocks. He saw her life here. The struggle, yes, but also the determination, the refusal to give up even when everything was hard. "Yes," he said simply. "Still interested." Something in Claire's expression cracked, just slightly. "You're either the most genuine person I've ever met, or the best liar." "Only one way to find out." "I suppose so." She moved to her tiny kitchen, filled a kettle. "Fair warning, I'm difficult. I push people away when they get too close. I'm too cynical for my own good. And I will probably sabotage this at some point because I'm better at protecting myself than letting people in. Noted. I'm emotionally unavailable, married to my work, and have a 6-year-old who will definitely become your responsibility if this gets serious. Also, I make decisions affecting thousands of people and regularly worry I'm destroying lives through incompetence disguised as leadership." Clara laughed despite herself. "We're a mess." "Completely." Adrian sat at her small table, which wobbled. "But maybe that's better than pretending to have everything figured out." They talked until past midnight, drinking tea that turned cold while they forgot to drink it. Clara eventually showed him some of her writing, tentatively, like she was handing over something fragile, and Adrian read it while she watched his face for reactions. Her work was raw, honest, occasionally brutal in its assessment of human nature. It wasn't polished, but it was real in a way that most things he read weren't. "This is good," he said when he finished. "You're lying to be nice. I'm really not. It needs work, but the core is there. You have a voice. That's the part you can't teach." Clara took her laptop back, closed it carefully. "My creative writing professor said I'd never make it as a writer because I couldn't write hopeful endings." "Your creative writing professor was wrong about a lot of things, apparently." When Adrian finally left, walking back down the 5 flights at 1 a.m., he felt like he'd crossed some threshold he couldn't uncross. This wasn't casual anymore. This was real, complicated, full of potential to hurt them both. His phone buzzed as he hit the street. A text from Clara. "Thank you for seeing my life and not running away." He typed back, "Thank you for letting me see it." The subway ride home was long and gave him too much time to think. About Clara's apartment and her writing and the way she'd looked when she'd asked if he was still interested. About Oliver, asleep at home, unaware his father was making decisions that would reshape both their lives. About the gap between his world and Clara's, and whether wanting to bridge it was enough to actually do it. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from his operations manager about the delayed Brooklyn project, marked urgent. Adrian almost opened it, then decided it could wait until morning. For once, work could wait. He made it home just before 2 a.m., exhausted but more awake than he'd felt in years. Over the next 3 weeks, Adrian and Clara built something that didn't have a name yet, but felt dangerous in its intensity. They met in the spaces between their lives, early mornings before Clara's shift, late evenings after Adrian put Oliver to bed, stolen afternoons when he could justify leaving the office. They existed in coffee shops and bookstores, on park benches and subway platforms. Anywhere that wasn't his world or hers, but some third place where they could pretend the gap between them didn't matter. Adrian learned that Clara took her coffee black after noon because the sugar made her jittery, that she had a scar on her left hand from a cooking accident when she was 12, that she talked to herself when she wrote and didn't realize she was doing it. Clara learned that Adrian ran every morning at 5:30 to quiet his mind, that he still kept his late wife's favorite coffee mug in his office even though he never used it, that he made terrible jokes when he was nervous and knew they were terrible but couldn't stop himself. "That's the worst pun I've ever heard," Clara said one afternoon, throwing a wadded napkin at him across the table at their usual cafe in Fort Greene. They'd been debating the merits of autobiographical fiction for 20 minutes, and Adrian had made some comment about truth being stranger than fiction, but fiction being stranger than truth, which had devolved into wordplay that made them both groan. I have worse ones, Adrian warned. Please don't prove that. What do you call a book club that's been stuck on the same book for years? Clara covered her face with her hands. I don't want to know. A novel concept. I'm leaving. I'm getting up right now and leaving you here. But she was laughing, and Adrian felt something warm spread through his chest at the sound. These moments, stupid, simple, completely divorced from the weight of his real life, had become the things he looked forward to most. Not the multi-million-dollar deals or the successful project launches, but the way Clara's nose scrunched when she laughed, the particular tone of voice she used when she was about to say something she thought he'd disagree with. The problem was that real life kept interrupting. It started small. A missed lunch because a video conference with Tokyo ran late. A canceled evening walk because Oliver got sick and Adrian needed to be home. Clara never complained, just sent understanding texts and rescheduled. But Adrian could feel the pattern forming, his obligations always taking precedence, her flexibility always accommodating his limitations. It's fine, Clara said when he apologized for the third time in a week. They were walking through Prospect Park, finally managing to sync their schedules on a Thursday afternoon. You have responsibilities. I get it. You keep saying that, but your voice says something different. My voice says exactly what I mean. You're reading things into it. Clara, she stopped walking, turned to face him. What do you want me to say, Adrian? That it bothers me when you cancel? That I sit around waiting for your texts because my life is apparently so empty that you've become the most interesting thing in it? Her voice was sharp, defensive. I knew what I was signing up for. Rich guy with a kid and a company to run. I don't get to complain about the natural consequences. You're allowed to be frustrated. I'm allowed to be realistic. This is what dating you looks like. I either accept it or I don't. She started walking again, faster now. I'm accepting it. But Adrian could see the lie in the set of her shoulders, the way she wouldn't quite look at him. He caught up, gently grabbed her arm. Hey, talk to me. Actually talk to me. Clara stopped but didn't turn around. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. I'm scared I'm becoming one of those women who rearranges her entire life around some guy's schedule, who waits by her phone and pretends she doesn't care when plans fall through. I told myself I'd never be that person. You're not. I am, though. I turned down extra shifts at work because I thought we'd have time together. I stopped making plans with the few friends I have because what if you were free? I'm turning myself into a supporting character in your story, and I hate that I'm doing it, but I can't seem to stop. Adrian felt her words land like physical blows. He'd been so focused on carving out time for her that he hadn't noticed how one-sided the compromise had become. His life continued largely unchanged. Same job, same routine, same priorities with Clara fitted into the gaps. Her life had reorganized itself around his availability. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't. You're too busy running an empire and raising a kid. I'm just the interesting distraction you see when you have free time. She pulled away from his grip. That came out wrong. I didn't mean. No, you're right. That's exactly what's happening. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. I don't know how to fix it. I can't make my schedule less demanding. Oliver needs me. The company needs me. But you need me too, and I'm failing at that. I don't need you, Clara said quickly, too quickly. I want you around. There's a difference. Is there? They stood in silence, surrounded by people walking dogs and pushing strollers and living normal lives that didn't require constant negotiation. Adrian wanted to make promises that he'd do better, be more present, find more time, but they all sounded hollow, even in his head. Maybe we need to slow down, Clara said finally. Take some pressure off. See each other when it works naturally instead of forcing it. That's a breakup in slow motion. It's practical. It's you running away because this got too real. Clara's eyes flashed. Don't psychoanalyze me. You don't know what I'm thinking. I know that every time we get close to something that matters, you find a reason to put distance between us. This is just the latest excuse. An excuse? Your company owns half of Brooklyn, and you're raising a child alone. Those aren't small things I'm competing with. They're your entire life, and I'm starting to realize there's no room left for anything else. That's not fair. Fair doesn't matter. True does. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking exhausted. I can't keep doing this, waiting for scraps of your time, pretending it's enough. convincing myself that wanting more makes me needy or unreasonable. I'm tired, Adrian. I'm so tired of always being the one who adjusts. Adrian wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words stuck in his throat because he knew she wasn't. He'd been treating her like an addition to his life rather than a priority in it, and the unfairness of that was suddenly impossible to ignore. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. Figure out if this actually matters to you or if I'm just a nice story you tell yourself about staying connected to real people." She started walking toward the park exit. "I need to get to work. I'm covering someone's shift tonight." Clara, wait. But she didn't wait, and Adrian didn't follow. He stood in the middle of Prospect Park while joggers and cyclists moved around him, feeling like he'd just lost something important without quite understanding how it had happened. His phone buzzed. Text from Jennifer. "Board meeting moved up to 4 p.m. Need you back ASAP." Adrian looked at his watch. 2:47 p.m. He could make it if he left now, catch the subway back to Manhattan, slip into the version of himself that made corporate decisions and signed documents and pretended everything was under control. The familiar routine calling him back. He texted Clara instead. "I'm sorry. For all of it. You deserve better than what I've been giving you." The response came 10 minutes later. "Yeah, I probably do." The board meeting was exactly as tedious as Adrian expected. 3 hours of old men arguing about risk assessments and market projections while he tried to focus and failed. His mind kept drifting back to Clara's face in the park, the exhaustion in her voice when she'd said she was tired. He'd done that. Made her tired. Turned something that should have been good into another thing she had to manage around the edges of her actual life. "Adrian, your thoughts on the Singapore timeline?" He looked up to find 12 faces staring at him expectantly. "Sorry, what?" David, his operations manager, repeated the question about construction delays and permit issues. Adrian provided an answer that satisfied them enough to move on, but he caught Jennifer giving him a concerned look from across the room. He was off his game, and everyone could tell. The meeting finally ended at 7. Adrian checked his phone. No messages from Clara. He thought about texting her again, decided against it. She'd asked for space, or something like space. He should probably respect that instead of pushing. Oliver was already asleep when he got home, Maria reading in the living room with the television on mute. She looked up when he entered, took one look at his face, and set her book aside. "Bad day? Is it that obvious?" "You look like someone kicked your dog. What happened?" Adrian collapsed onto the couch beside her. "I think I'm screwing up the best thing that's happened to me in years, and I don't know how to fix it." Maria had worked for him long enough to know when to push and when to just listen. She chose listening now, letting the silence stretch until Adrian was ready to fill it. "There's someone," he said finally. "Clara. I met her a few weeks ago, and she's different, real. Doesn't care about the money or the company or any of the things that usually define me, but I can't figure out how to make space for her in my life without everything else falling apart." "Does she want space in your life?" "She did, I think. Now I'm not sure. We had a fight today about time and priorities and all the ways I'm not showing up the way she needs me to. Was she right?" Adrian thought about it honestly. "Yeah, she was completely right. So what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know. I can't make the company less demanding. I can't make Oliver need me less. And I can't ask Clara to keep accepting whatever scraps of attention I can give her between everything else." Maria was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something you probably don't want to hear?" "Do I have a choice?" "Not really. You've been using your responsibilities as armor for years now. The company, Oliver. All the very legitimate reasons you can't let anyone get close. And they are legitimate. I'm not saying they're not, but you're also hiding behind them. That's not..." "Let me finish. After Sarah died, you threw yourself into work and parenting like if you just stayed busy enough, you wouldn't have to deal with being alone. And it worked, mostly. But now there's someone who actually sees you, and instead of making room for that, you're using the same excuses to keep her at a distance, because being busy is safer than being vulnerable." The words hit harder than they should have because they were true. Adrian had built his life into something that didn't require emotional risk. Work was predictable. Oliver's love was unconditional. And as long as he stayed in motion, he didn't have to examine whether he was actually happy or just functional. "I don't know how to be vulnerable anymore," he admitted. "Every time I try, it feels like I'm doing it wrong." That's because you're out of practice. But Clara seems worth the practice, from what you've said about her. She is. That's what makes this worse. She deserves someone who can actually give her what she needs, and I'm not sure I'm that person. Have you asked her what she needs? Or are you just assuming? Adrian realized he hadn't. He'd been so focused on managing his own guilt about canceled plans and limited time that he'd never actually asked Clara what would make this work for her. He'd just assumed his schedule was the immovable object, and she had to work around it. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number, which resolved itself into a photo that took a second to load. When it did, Adrian's breath caught. It was Clara, clearly at work based on the espresso machine visible behind her, holding up a piece of paper with messy handwriting. I'm sorry too, can we try again? Differently this time? He texted back immediately. Yes, whatever differently looks like. I'm in. The response came quickly. Good. Because I have thoughts about what differently means and you're not going to like all of them. Try me. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Corner grind. I'm making you the most complicated drink I can think of, and we're going to have an actual conversation about what this is and what it can't be. No romanticizing, just reality. Adrian smiled despite himself. Deal. But I reserve the right to make terrible puns. You're the worst. You texted me first, temporary lapse in judgment, already regretting it. He put his phone away, feeling something loosen in his chest. Maria was watching him with an expression that suggested she'd already figured out what had happened. You're smiling, she observed. Apparently I get a second chance to not screw this up. Don't waste it then. And Adrian, whatever conversation you're about to have with her, be honest. About what you can actually give, not what you wish you could give. That's the only way this works. The next morning, Adrian arrived at Corner Grind at 9:54, which was probably too early, but he'd been awake since 5 thinking about what Maria had said. Clara was already there, setting up for the morning rush with the bearded barista whose name Adrian still didn't know. She saw him come in and held up a finger. 1 minute. He nodded, found a table, waited. The cafe filled slowly with the usual morning crowd, and Adrian watched Clara work with the same efficiency he'd seen before. But today he noticed other things too, the way she winced when she bent to grab something from under the counter, suggesting her back hurt. The forced brightness in her customer service voice that disappeared the second people turned away. The exhaustion around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. This was her reality. 60 hours a week on her feet, making drinks for people who barely acknowledged her existence. Going home to a 5th-floor walk-up where she tried to convince herself she was a writer despite never having time to actually write. And he'd been treating her life like it was flexible while his was fixed. Like her time mattered less because she wasn't managing a company or raising a child. The morning rush died down around 10:15. Clara untied her apron, said something to her coworker, and made 2 drinks before joining Adrian at his table. She set a cup in front of him that was topped with foam art, a heart, ironically, and sat down across from him with her own drink. Triple shot vanilla lavender oat milk latte with cinnamon, she said, gesturing to his cup. The most annoyingly complicated thing I could make without violating health codes. Adrian took a sip. It was actually delicious. I hate that this is good. I'm very talented at my job. I'm just tired of being talented at something that doesn't matter to anyone, including myself. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. We need to talk. I know. And I need you to listen without trying to fix everything or make promises you can't keep. Okay. Clara took a breath. I like you. More than I should, probably, given that we barely know each other and our lives don't make any sense together. But I can't keep doing what we've been doing, the stolen moments, the constant rescheduling, the feeling like I'm always waiting for you to have time for me. I understand. I'm not done. If we're going to do this, actually do this, then it has to be equal. Not in time because I know your schedule is insane, but in priority. I need to know that when you make a plan with me, it matters as much as your board meetings and your calls with investors. That I'm not just the thing you do when everything else is handled. You're right, that's fair. I also need you to stop trying to fix my life. I don't need you to solve my problems or offer me money or connections or whatever wealthy people do when they want to help. I need you to just be present, to see my life as it is, and not as something that needs improving. That one stung because Adrian knew he'd already been mentally cataloging ways to make Clara's life easier, introduce her to a publisher he knew, help with rent so she could work less. 100 small interventions that would have been about his comfort more than her actual needs. Noted, he said quietly. And I need you to be honest with me about Oliver. If this gets serious, I'm going to be part of his life, and I need to know what that actually means. Not the romanticized version where I'm the cool person who shows up sometimes. The real version where I might have to help with homework and handle tantrums and be an adult in his life. I haven't introduced him to anyone since Sarah died. I know. That's why we need to talk about it now, before we get any deeper, and it becomes impossible to untangle. Claire's voice softened slightly. I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm trying to make sure we're both walking into this with our eyes open. Adrian set down his ridiculous latte and looked at her directly. My turn? Your turn. I'm terrible at this. At being with someone, at making space in my life for things that aren't work or Oliver. I've been functioning on autopilot for so long that having feelings for you is honestly terrifying because it means I have to start making choices instead of just reacting to whatever's in front of me. Clara started to speak, but he held up a hand. I'm not done. You're right that I've been treating your time as less valuable than mine. That's not because I think it is. It's because I'm used to everyone accommodating me, and I forgot that's not actually how relationships work. I want to do better, but I'm going to mess up. Probably a lot. I need you to tell me when I do instead of just absorbing it until you explode. Fair. And about Oliver, I'm terrified of you meeting him because what if you decide this isn't worth it? What if he gets attached, and then you leave and I have to explain to a 6-year-old why another person he cared about isn't in his life anymore? Adrian's voice cracked slightly. I can handle you leaving. I'm not sure I can handle him going through that. Clara reached across the table, took his hand. Her fingers were warm from her coffee cup. I can't promise I'll never leave. That's not fair to either of us. But I can promise I won't treat him like he's disposable. If we get to the point where I'm meeting Oliver, it's because I'm serious about this. About you. Not just dabbling in the interesting parts of your life. They sat in silence for a moment, hands linked across a wobbly cafe table, while around them people ordered coffee and complained about the weather and lived their normal lives. So where do we go from here, Yes? Adrian asked. We try. Actually try, not just drift along hoping it works out. We set boundaries. We communicate like adults instead of making assumptions. And we both accept that this might not work despite our best efforts. That's very pragmatic. I'm a pragmatic person. You're going to have to get used to that. I think I can manage. Clara smiled, and it reached her eyes for the first time that morning. Good, because my first boundary is that I need at least one full evening a week that's actually planned in advance, not squeezed in when you have a gap in your schedule. Actually planned, like you would plan a board meeting. Done. What else? You have to stop apologizing every time work interferes. I know it's going to happen. Just tell me when plans change and we'll reschedule. The constant apologies make me feel like I'm supposed to be upset, which makes me actually upset even when I wasn't initially. That's fair? Anything else? Yeah, you have to let me pay for things sometimes. Not everything. I know our financial situations are different, but sometimes. I need to feel like an equal partner, not someone being taken care of. Adrian thought about arguing, about explaining that money meant nothing to him and spending it on her was easy, but he remembered her words about not fixing her life. Okay, we split things or take turns, whatever feels right. Thank you. She squeezed his hand before letting go. Your turn. What do you need? No one had asked him that in years. Adrian had to think about it, sorting through what he actually needed versus what he thought he should need. Patience. I'm going to cancel sometimes, and I'm going to feel terrible about it, and I need you to believe me when I say it's not because you don't matter. You do. You matter more than most things in my life right now, which is honestly scary to admit. I can do patience. What else? Understanding that Oliver comes first, always. If there's a choice between you and him, I'm choosing him. That's not negotiable. I wouldn't respect you if you didn't. Clara leaned back in her chair. Anything else? Yeah. When you get scared and want to push me away, because I know you will, you already told me you're good at that. Just tell me instead of picking fights or creating distance. I can handle fear, I can't handle guessing games. Clara's expression shifted, became more vulnerable. That's going to be hard for me. I know, but we're both going to have to do hard things if this is going to work. They finished their coffee while the cafe continued its morning rhythm around them. Adrian checked his watch and realized he'd been there for almost 2 hours. 2 hours when he should have been in the office, handling the 17 things that were probably on fire by now. For once, He didn't feel guilty about it. I should get back to work, Clara said reluctantly. Saturday shift starts in 20 minutes, and Jake will kill me if I'm late. Jake is the bearded guy? Jake is the bearded guy who has covered for me more times than I can count. I owe him approximately 1,000,000 favors. She stood, gathered their empty cups. What are you doing Saturday night? Probably something boring with spreadsheets. Why? There's a reading at a bookstore in the village. Local writers sharing their work. I was thinking about going, but I could be convinced to bring a date if he promises not to make fun of amateur fiction. I would never make fun of amateur fiction. You absolutely would, but I appreciate the lie. She headed back toward the counter, then turned. 7 p.m. The bookstore is called Ink and Paper. Don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it. Adrian left the cafe feeling like they'd just negotiated the terms of something important, which he supposed they had. Relationships as contract, boundaries and expectations clearly defined. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it felt more honest than anything he'd experienced before. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, and the normal chaos of running a company that seemed determined to generate new problems faster than he could solve them. The Brooklyn project that had been flagged as urgent turned out to be even more urgent than initially reported. Structural issues that required immediate attention unless they wanted the building to fail inspection. Adrian spent 3 days in back-to-back meetings with engineers and contractors, fighting to fix the problems without cutting corners that would compromise safety. We can reinforce the foundation, but it's going to add 6 weeks to the timeline and about $3 million to the budget, David explained during yet another crisis meeting. Or we can use the cheaper materials and hope the inspectors don't look too closely. We're not hoping inspectors don't look closely. We're fixing it properly. Adrian signed off on the budget increase that would make their investors furious. People are going to live in this building. That matters more than our profit margin. David made a note, but didn't look happy about it. Adrian was used to that reaction by now. His insistence on quality over profit made him unpopular with the people who cared primarily about returns on investment. But he'd built Vail Industries on the principle that you could make money without exploiting people, and he wasn't about to change that now just because it was inconvenient. He made it to the reading on Saturday with 10 minutes to spare, which felt like a victory given that he'd had to leave a conference call early and dodge 3 attempts by his assistant to schedule an emergency meeting. The bookstore was small and crowded, chairs arranged in uneven rows facing a small podium. Clara sat near the back, saving a seat beside her. "You came," she said when he slid into the chair. "I told you I would." "You also told me you'd be on time, and it's 7:09. Traffic was terrible." "You took the subway." "Subway traffic. Very congested trains." Clara rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. The reading started. 5 local writers sharing pieces that ranged from genuinely moving to painfully amateur. Adrian tried to pay attention, but found himself more interested in watching Clara's reactions. The way she leaned forward during the good parts and winced during the bad parts, completely absorbed despite the uneven quality. During the break between readers, she turned to him. "What do you think so far?" "Honestly, mixed bag. But the woman who read second was genuinely talented." "She was. Made me feel like I should just give up now and save everyone the trouble of reading my mediocre work." "That's not what you actually think." "It's exactly what I think. She's probably 23 and already miles ahead of where I am at 30. Clara slumped slightly in her seat. "I hate that I'm jealous of someone I don't even know." "Jealousy means you care. That's better than indifference." "Is it? Because indifference seems less exhausting." The reading resumed before Adrian could respond. The final 2 readers were less impressive, one clearly using fiction as thinly veiled therapy, and the other reading something that might have been experimental but mostly seemed confused. When it ended, people mingled and talked, forming the kind of literary social clusters that made Adrian immediately uncomfortable. "Want to get out of here?" Clara asked, reading his expression. Desperately. They escaped into the village at night, the streets full of people looking for bars and restaurants and whatever else drew crowds on a Saturday evening. Clara led them to a small wine bar she knew, the kind of place that looked like it might collapse but had been there for 40 years and would probably outlast them all. "I used to come here when I first moved to the city," Claire explained as they found a corner table. "Back when I thought I'd be a successful writer by 25 and could afford to drink wine that cost more than $6 a glass." "What happened to that version of you?" She ran into reality, Turns out talent and determination aren't enough when you also need to eat and pay rent. Clara studied the wine list without much interest. I still come here sometimes when I want to remember what hope felt like. That's incredibly depressing. Welcome to my brain. It's not a fun place. They ordered wine that was definitely more than $6 a glass, Adrian's doing, despite Clara's protest, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of conversation they'd developed over the past weeks. Clara told him about a regular customer at the cafe who asked for a cappuccino with no foam every single day, apparently not understanding what a cappuccino was. Adrian told her about his board's reaction to the Brooklyn project budget increase and the 3-hour argument about whether safety standards were negotiable. They wanted you to compromise on safety? Clara looked genuinely horrified. Not in those words, but yes, essentially. Profit over people, dressed up in corporate language about market realities and shareholder value. What did you tell them? That they could either approve the budget or find a new CEO. I'm not building death traps just to save money. Adrian took a sip of wine. They approved it, reluctantly, but I'm pretty sure they're looking for ways to undermine me now. Can they do that? They can try. I own enough of the company that it would be difficult, but corporate politics are complicated. Enough people wanting you gone can make your life very difficult, even if they can't actually fire you. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing. Does that scare you? Honestly? Not as much as it probably should. The worst they can do is force me out, and sometimes I think that might not be terrible. I could spend more time with Oliver, actually have a life instead of just reacting to crises. He paused. I could have time for you without constantly feeling guilty about what I'm not doing. Don't make me part of your escape fantasy. If you want to quit, quit. But don't do it because of some relationship that's barely a month old. I'm not saying I'd quit. I'm saying that the idea doesn't terrify me the way it probably should. And that's new. Adrian met her eyes across the table. You've changed something in me. Made me question whether success is actually worth what I've been sacrificing for it. That sounds like a lot of pressure to put on someone you're still getting to know. It is, but it's also true. They stayed at the wine bar until closing, talking about everything and nothing. Clara's attempts to write something meaningful, Adrian's complicated relationship with his father's legacy, the specific loneliness of living in a city full of millions of people who didn't know you existed. When they finally left, stumbling slightly from wine and exhaustion, Clara let Adrian walk her to the subway. I had a good time tonight, she said when they reached the station entrance. Even the painful amateur fiction parts. Me too. We should do this again. The planned in advance version, not the hope our schedules align version. Next Saturday, there's a gallery opening in Chelsea I was thinking about going to. Probably terrible art, but free wine. Terrible art and free wine sounds perfect. Adrian hesitated, then said, Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think this can actually work? Us, I mean, given all the complications and the obstacles and the fundamental differences in our lives? Clara considered this seriously, not rushing to answer with platitudes. I don't know. Most of the time, I think we're setting ourselves up for spectacular failure. But then I spend time with you, and I can't quite convince myself to give up on it yet. She stepped closer. Ask me again in 6 months. Maybe by then one of us will have come to our senses. Or maybe we'll have figured out how to make it work. That would be nice. Unlikely, but nice. She kissed him then, brief, soft, full of promise and uncertainty in equal measure. Then she disappeared down the subway stairs, leaving Adrian standing on a Manhattan street corner feeling like he'd just made either the best or worst decision of his life. Possibly both. The text came at 1:47 a.m., pulling Adrian from sleep he'd just barely fallen into. He grabbed his phone, expecting work crisis or family emergency, and found instead a message from Clara. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about all the ways this is going to fall apart and trying to convince myself to end it now before it gets worse. Then I remember the way you listened to those terrible readings without complaining, and I think maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is worth the risk. Thought you should know. Adrian stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, I'm scared too, but I'd rather try and fail than never know what this could have been. Go to sleep. We'll figure it out. The response came quickly. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who's going to get hurt when reality sets in. You think I won't get hurt? I think you'll recover faster. People always do when they have other things that matter more. Adrian sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake and frustrated. He called instead of texting, and Clara answered on the second ring. "It's almost 2 in the morning," she said by way of greeting. "I know, but I'm not doing this through text messages." He took a breath. "You keep assuming you're disposable to me. That because I have money and a company and Oliver, you're just this temporary thing I'll forget about when it gets inconvenient. But you're wrong." "Am I?" "Yes. You're the first person in years who's made me feel like myself instead of just the role I play. You're the reason I started questioning whether the life I've built is actually the life I want. That's not nothing, Clara. That's not something I'm going to just forget about when things get hard." Silence on the other end. Then quietly, "I don't know how to believe that." "I know, but I'm going to keep saying it until you do." Adrian lay back against his pillows. "You asked me earlier if I thought this could work. The truth is, I have no idea. Maybe we're completely incompatible and this ends in disaster, but I know I want to try. Actually try, not just drift along hoping for the best. That has to count for something." "It does." Claire's voice was softer now, less defensive. "I'm sorry. I get in my own head and spiral and assume the worst. I know, that's allowed. But talk to me when it happens instead of sending cryptic texts in the middle of the night." These weren't cryptic, they were pretty direct. Fair point. Still, talking is better. They stayed on the phone for another hour, voices getting quieter as exhaustion set in. Clara told him about the novel she kept starting and abandoning, about the fear that she'd never be good enough to say anything that mattered. Adrian told her about the impossible standards he set for himself, about the constant anxiety that he was failing Oliver despite all his efforts. By the time they finally hung up, it was past 3 and Adrian had to be up in 2 hours, but he felt more settled than he had in days. Things were complicated, things were difficult. But for the first time in years, Adrian felt like he was moving towards something instead of just away from pain. That had to mean something, even if he had no idea where it was leading. The crash came 3 weeks later at an art exhibit in Soho, which was ironic because the evening had started with such promise. Adrian had actually cleared his schedule properly this time, rescheduled 2 meetings, delegated a site inspection to David, and left the office at 4 p.m. like a person with boundaries. Clara had gotten the night off by switching shifts with Jake, who'd given her significant grief about it until she'd agreed to cover his Saturday morning shift for the next month. They met at the gallery at 6, both slightly breathless from rushing but proud of themselves for actually making it happen. The exhibit was exactly the kind of pretentious contemporary art that made Adrian want to laugh. Installations involving shopping carts and commentary about consumerism, video loops of people staring at cameras, sculptures made from reclaimed materials that mostly just looked like garbage arranged intentionally. "This is awful," Clara whispered as they stood in front of something that appeared to be a mannequin covered in credit cards. "It's making a statement about capitalism," Adrian said in his best serious art critic voice. "The statement is, I had a deadline and ran out of ideas." They wandered through the exhibit making quiet jokes, drinking the free wine that was surprisingly decent, feeling like they'd finally figured out how to exist in the same space without the weight of their complications crushing everything. Clara looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the simple black dress she'd borrowed from her roommate. It was the looseness in her shoulders, the genuine smile, the way she'd stopped looking like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Adrian's phone rang at 7:23. He checked it, saw Jennifer's name, and sent it to voicemail. The second call came 2 minutes later. Same response. The third call came immediately after, and this time it was David's number. "I should take this," Adrian said, already feeling the evening starting to slip away. "It's my operations manager. He doesn't call unless something's actually wrong." Clara's expression shifted. Not angry, just resigned. "Go ahead." Adrian stepped into the gallery's lobby, answered. "David, this better be important. We have a problem. A big one. That Brooklyn project, the one we just spent $3 million fixing, turns out the contractor we hired for the foundation work cut corners anyway. The inspection is scheduled for Monday, and we're going to fail spectacularly unless we can fix it this weekend." Adrian felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How bad?" Bad enough that if we fail inspection, we're looking at a full stop work order, which means delays, penalties, potential lawsuits from the investors, and our reputation taking a massive hit. David's voice was tight. I need you to come to the site now. We have to make decisions about how to handle this before the crews arrive tomorrow morning. Now? It's Saturday night. I know what night it is, Adrian, but this can't wait. We're talking about a project that could sink the company if we screw it up. Adrian looked back through the gallery doors at Clara, who was pretending to study a particularly ugly sculpture while obviously waiting for him to return. They'd made plans for after the exhibit, dinner at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try, maybe a walk through Washington Square Park if the weather held. An actual full evening together, the kind they'd been promising each other for weeks. Give me 20 minutes, Adrian said. I'll meet you there. He hung up and walked back to Clara, already seeing her expression change as she read his face. You have to go, she said before he could speak. There's a crisis with the Brooklyn project, the one I've been fighting about for weeks. If I don't handle this now, it could seriously damage the company. I understand. But her voice had that carefully neutral tone that meant she absolutely didn't understand, or worse, understood completely and was tired of understanding. Clara, no, really, it's fine. You have responsibilities. Go handle them. She set down her wine glass with deliberate care. I'll just head home. Come with me, to the site. It won't be interesting, but at least we'd be together. You want me to stand around a construction site watching you have meetings? That sounds terrible. It would be terrible. But the alternative is ending our evening at 7:30, and I don't want to do that. Clara studied his face, and Adrian could see her working through the math. How many times had this happened now? How many canceled plans, interrupted dates, moments where his life had taken precedence over hers? He'd lost count, but apparently she hadn't. Just go, she said finally. I'm tired anyway. We'll reschedule. When? I don't know, Adrian. When you have time. That's how this works, right? I accommodate your schedule because your schedule matters more than mine. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's true. She grabbed her jacket from the coat check. Text me later, or don't. Whatever makes sense for your crisis timeline. She left before he could respond, pushing through the gallery doors into the Soho evening while Adrian stood frozen in the lobby holding a wine glass he didn't remember picking up. He should have followed her, should have chosen her over the project for once, should have told David to handle it himself because surely Adrian wasn't the only person capable of making decisions. But he didn't. He set down the wine glass, headed to Brooklyn, and spent the next 6 hours in a construction trailer arguing with David and the contractor about how to fix foundation work that never should have needed fixing in the first place. By the time solutions were found and plans were made and the crisis was downgraded from catastrophic to merely terrible, it was past 1 a.m. and Adrian felt like he'd been awake for days. He texted Clara from the car service taking him home. I'm sorry. You were right to be angry. I shouldn't have gone. The response came 20 minutes later. You had to go. I get it. That's the problem. I get it, and I hate that I get it. Can we talk tomorrow? I'm working a double shift, covering for Jake since he covered for me tonight. Sunday, then? Maybe. I need some time to think. Adrian stared at that last message for a long time, understanding what she wasn't saying. She needed time to decide if this was worth continuing, if the pattern they'd fallen into was something she could actually live with long term. He wanted to argue, to tell her they could fix it, but he was too exhausted to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. Sunday passed in anxious silence. Adrian took Oliver to the Museum of Natural History, tried to be present for his son's excitement about dinosaurs and space rocks, mostly failed. His mind kept drifting back to Clara's expression in the gallery, the resignation in her voice when she'd told him to just go. Oliver noticed his distraction, asked if he was okay, and Adrian lied and said he was fine. You seem sad, Oliver observed with the brutal honesty of 6-year-olds. Is it because of work? Something like that, buddy. You're always sad about work. Maybe you should get a different job. It's not that simple. Why not? Adrian had no good answer for that. He changed the subject, bought Oliver an overpriced stuffed dinosaur from the gift shop, took him home and let Maria handle bedtime while he sat in his office staring at emails he couldn't bring himself to answer. Monday morning brought no message from Clara. Neither did Monday afternoon or evening or the next 3 days. Adrian resisted the urge to show up at the cafe, understanding that she'd asked for space and violating that would only make things worse. But the silence felt like a physical weight, pressing down on everything else he was trying to manage. The Brooklyn project passed inspection on Wednesday, barely, and Adrian should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt nothing except the growing certainty that he'd traded something irreplaceable for something that ultimately didn't matter as much as he'd convinced himself it did. The company would survive either way. His reputation would recover from any setback. But Clara might not wait around for him to figure out his priorities. Thursday evening, his phone finally rang with her number. Adrian answered before the first ring finished. "Hi," Clara said, and her voice sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Hi, how are you?" "Confused, mostly. Can we meet? Actually talk instead of texting around the issue?" "Of course. When?" "Now. I just got off shift. I'm still at the cafe." Adrian checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. He had a dinner with potential investors at 8. The kind of thing Jennifer had emphasized was non-negotiable. He looked at his calendar, at the carefully constructed schedule that governed his entire life, and made a decision. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. He called Jennifer on the way to the subway, told her to cancel the investor dinner, ignored her protests about how difficult it had been to schedule and how unprofessional canceling would look. For once, something else mattered more. He'd figure out the consequences later. Clara was waiting outside Corner Grind when he arrived, sitting on the curb with a coffee cup, and looking small in a way that made Adrian's chest hurt. He sat down beside her without asking, their shoulders touching. "You came," she said. "You called." "Of course I came." "You had that dinner thing. Jennifer mentioned it when she called the cafe yesterday looking for you." "I canceled it." Clara turned to look at him fully. "You canceled an investor dinner? For me? For us? For this conversation? Because apparently I needed a crisis to figure out that some things are more important than maintaining my perfect professional reputation." Adrian took a breath. "You asked for time to think. What did you decide?" "That I'm not strong enough to do this." Clara's voice cracked slightly. "I want to be. I want to be the cool, understanding girlfriend who doesn't mind that her boyfriend's entire life takes precedence over their relationship. But I can't. Every time you choose work over me, it feels like confirmation that I was right all along, that I don't actually matter enough to prioritize." "That's not true." "Isn't it? Saturday night you left me standing in a gallery so you could fix a foundation problem, which was probably the right call. I'm not saying it wasn't, but it hurt anyway, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt." Adrian wanted to defend himself, to explain that the Brooklyn project wasn't just about money, but about housing for families who needed it, that his decisions affected real people's lives. But he realized that would just prove her point, that even now he was prioritizing the abstract concept of his work over the actual person sitting beside him. "You're right," he said instead. "I've been treating you like you're supposed to understand and accept that my life is non-negotiable and yours is flexible. That's not fair, and it's not sustainable, and I don't blame you for being done with it." Clara wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm not done. That's the problem. I should be done. Any reasonable person would be done. But I'm not, and I hate that I'm not, because staying means accepting that I'm always going to be second place." "What if you didn't have to be?" "What does that even mean, Adrian? You can't change who you are or what your life requires. And I can't change the fact that I need to matter to someone, actually matter, not just fit into the gaps of their schedule." Adrian had been thinking about this for days, turning it over in his mind during meetings and sleepless nights, and the quiet moments when Oliver was asleep, and he had nothing to distract him from the truth. He'd been approaching this all wrong from the beginning, trying to add Clara to his existing life instead of building something new that actually had room for both of them. "What if I stepped back from Vail Industries?" The words came out before he'd fully formed the thought, but once they were out there, he realized he meant them. "Not completely. I'd still be involved, still make the major decisions, but day-to-day operations, the constant crisis management, the meetings that eat my entire life, what if I hired someone to handle that?" Clara stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. I've been thinking about it anyway. The company doesn't actually need me micromanaging everything. It needs someone who's willing to do that, and I'm not that person anymore. Maybe I never was." He turned to face her fully. "I built Vail Industries because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. Prove I deserve my father's legacy, make something that mattered, all of that. But somewhere along the way, it became the only thing I cared about besides Oliver. And that's not enough anymore." You're talking about restructuring your entire life for a relationship that's barely 2 months old and might not even work out. I'm talking about restructuring my life for me because I'm tired of living like every minute is scheduled and every deviation is a crisis. Because I want space to figure out who I actually am when I'm not performing the role of CEO. Because Oliver deserves a father who's present, not just physically around. Adrian reached for her hand. And yes, because I want a relationship with you that isn't constantly fighting against my schedule. But even if this doesn't work out, I'd still make the change. You've just made me realize it needs to happen. Clara was quiet for a long time, processing. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. That's a lot of pressure to put on this. On us. I know. But I'm not asking you to be responsible for my choices. I'm asking you to believe that I'm capable of making them for the right reasons. What if you resent me later? When the excitement wears off and you realize you gave up something important for something that didn't last? Then I deal with that. But Clara, the thing I'd be giving up is killing me anyway. Slowly, quietly, in ways I didn't even notice until you showed up and reminded me what it feels like to actually be alive instead of just functional. He squeezed her hand. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you to let me save myself while also making room for you. This is insane, Clara said, but she was smiling slightly. You're talking about upending your entire professional life because of a fight with your girlfriend. I'm talking about finally admitting that success isn't worth the cost I've been paying for it. Adrian pulled her closer. And you're not just my girlfriend. You're the person who saw through all my defenses and didn't run away when you realized how much of a mess I actually am. You're not a mess. I'm absolutely a mess. I'm just a mess with excellent PR and a good accountant. Clara laughed despite herself, and Adrian felt some of the tension between them ease. They sat on the curb outside her cafe while Brooklyn moved around them. People heading home from work, kids playing on the corner, the familiar rhythm of a neighborhood settling into evening. I need you to understand something, Clara said after a while. If you make these changes and we still don't work out, that's on both of us, not just me. I won't be responsible for you regretting your choices. Fair. And if you do this, you have to do it properly. Actually delegate, actually step back, actually give yourself the space you're talking about. Not just rearrange your schedule and call it change while still micromanaging everything from a different location. I can do that. Can you, though? Because from what I've seen, you're not great at letting go of control. Adrian thought about that honestly. She was right. His entire professional identity was built on being the person who made decisions, who carried responsibility, who fixed problems. Letting other people handle that would require trust he wasn't sure he'd developed yet. I'll have to learn, he admitted. It won't be easy, and I'll probably mess it up initially, but I want to try. Clara studied his face like she was looking for the crack in his certainty. Why? Why now? Why me? Why any of this? Because Oliver asked me last Sunday why I'm always sad about work. And I didn't have a good answer because I spent 6 hours Saturday night fixing a problem that could have been fixed by 10 other people while you went home alone. Because I'm 32 years old and I can't remember the last time I made a choice based on what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want. He met her eyes. And because losing you would hurt more than losing Vail Industries, and that tells me something important about my priorities. That's terrifyingly honest. You asked for honesty. I did. Doesn't make it less terrifying. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. If we do this, if you actually make these changes and we actually try to build something real, it's going to be hard. Not just the logistics, but emotionally. We're both going to have to be vulnerable in ways that scare us. I know. And we might fail anyway. We might do everything right and still realize we're not compatible in the ways that matter. That's possible. So why risk it? Adrian thought about how to answer that, sorting through all the reasons he could give, the connection they'd built, the way she made him feel seen, the specific comfort of her presence. But what he said was simpler, because not risking it feels worse. Clara lifted her head to look at him. Okay, let's try. Actually try, not just drift along hoping for the best. You make your changes. I work on not sabotaging things when I get scared. We both accept that this might crash and burn despite our best efforts. That's very pragmatic. I'm a pragmatic person. You're going to have to get used to that. I think I can manage. They sat together as the evening darkened around them, not talking, just existing in the same space without the weight of all their complications pressing down quite so hard. Adrian's phone buzzed multiple times. Jennifer probably, or David, or any number of people who needed him to make decisions, or solve problems, or be the version of himself that ran a company. For once, he ignored it. I should get home, Clara said eventually. Early shift tomorrow. Can I walk you? To Crown Heights? That's 40 blocks out of your way. I don't care about the direction. They walked together through Brooklyn at night, retracing the route they'd taken weeks ago when everything had still been new and theoretical. This time felt different, heavier with commitment, lighter with honesty. Claire told him about a regular customer who'd left a $20 tip that morning with a note saying her coffee had saved his life, which was probably hyperbole but had made her day anyway. Adrian told her about Oliver's latest obsession with black holes and whether people could survive falling into one.
What did you tell him? Claire asked. That physics says no, but imagination says maybe. And sometimes imagination is more important than physics. That's very philosophical for a 6-year-old.
He didn't understand most of it, but he liked the idea that rules could be broken if you thought about them differently. Adrian paused. Kind of like what I'm doing with the company, I guess. Everyone says I have to be CEO full-time or step away completely. I'm trying to figure out if there's a third option. What does that look like? I'm not sure yet. Maybe bringing in a COO to handle daily operations while I focus on the big picture stuff. The projects I actually care about. The decisions that align with why I started doing this in the first place. Keep the parts that matter. Delegate the parts that don't. That sounds reasonable. It sounds terrifying, but most good decisions do. They reached Clara's building and stood outside like they had that first night, the city noise filling the silence between them. Clara pulled out her keys, then turned back to Adrian. There's something I need to say before you make any major life changes. Okay. I wrote something, a story. Actually finished it for the first time in 3 years. She was looking at her keys instead of at him. It's about a woman who's afraid of wanting things because wanting things means admitting you don't have them, and about learning that vulnerability isn't the same as weakness. Can I read it?
Eventually, maybe, if I don't chicken out and delete it first. Clara finally met his eyes. My point is that you're not the only one making changes. I'm trying too. To be braver, to want things out loud, to stop protecting myself so much that I miss out on everything good. That's the scariest thing you've said all night. I know, but you're doing scary things, so I figured I should match you.
Adrian kissed her then, soft and careful, and full of the kind of promise that came from actually trying instead of just hoping. When they pulled apart, Clara was smiling. Go home, she said. Call your lawyer or your board or whoever you need to call to start making this happen. I'll be here when you're ready. You're sure? No, but I'm trying anyway. That has to count for something. Adrian walked home feeling lighter than he had in months, despite the fact that he was about to upend his entire professional life based on a conversation on a curb outside a Brooklyn cafe. His phone had 17 missed calls and 32 unread emails by the time he got back to his apartment. He ignored them all, poured himself a whiskey, and sat in his office thinking about what came next. The first call he made was to his attorney, who was predictably horrified by the idea of Adrian stepping back from day-to-day operations without a clear succession plan. The second call was to his most trusted board member, who was slightly less horrified but still concerned about investor reactions. The third call was to Maria, who listened to everything and then said simply, "It's about time." "You think I'm doing the right thing?" Adrian asked. "I think you've been running yourself into the ground for years, and this woman is apparently the first person who's made you realize that's not sustainable. So yes, I think you're doing the right thing, even if the execution is going to be messy." The execution was very messy. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian had 17 meetings with board members, lawyers, potential COO candidates, and investors who ranged from supportive to openly hostile about his plan. He fielded accusations of abandoning the company, of letting a relationship cloud his judgment, of failing to honor his father's legacy. He sat through a 6-hour emergency board meeting where 3 members argued for his complete removal rather than the restructuring he was proposing. Through it all, Clara maintained careful distance. Not pulling away, but giving him space to make decisions without feeling pressured or obligated.
They texted daily, mostly short check-ins, occasionally longer conversations when one of them couldn't sleep, but they didn't see each other. Adrian had asked for that, needing to prove to himself and to her that he was making these changes for the right reasons, not just because he was caught up in the romance of grand gestures.
"How's it going?" Clara asked during one of their late-night calls. "Terrible. Half my board wants me gone completely. The other half wants me to stay exactly as I am. Nobody seems interested in the middle ground I'm proposing." "What are you going to do?" "Push through anyway. I own enough shares that they can't actually force me out without my consent. They can make my life difficult, but they can't stop me." "That sounds exhausting." "It is. But I keep thinking about what you said, that I have to actually make changes, not just rearrange my schedule and pretend it's different. If I back down now, nothing actually changes." "I'm proud of you," Clara said quietly, in case nobody said that recently. The words hit Adrian harder than he expected. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." "I know. That's why I said it." 3 weeks after the conversation on the curb, Adrian finally found a COO candidate who didn't make him want to throw things. Elena Rodriguez, 47, formerly VP of Operations at a competitor, reputation for being brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. She interviewed on a Tuesday, spent Wednesday touring Vail Industries facilities and meeting with department heads, and on Thursday told Adrian she'd take the job on one condition.
"I need actual authority," Elena said during their final meeting. "Not just a fancy title while you continue to micromanage everything from behind the scenes. If I'm doing this, I'm actually doing it. You focus on vision and values and the projects you care about. I handle the execution and the daily crisis management. That's the plan." "Is it?" "Because I've seen this before, founders who say they want to step back but can't actually let go. I'm not interested in being your glorified assistant while you pretend to have work-life balance." Adrian appreciated her directness. "What if I screw up? What if I can't let go as much as I think I can? Then I'll tell you, loudly and repeatedly until you either fix it or fire me." Elena leaned forward. "Look, I've read about you, the projects you've built, the standards you maintain, the reputation you've earned. That doesn't happen by accident, but it also doesn't happen without cost, and I'm guessing you're finally realizing the cost is too high." "Something like that. So let me carry some of it. I'm good at this. Better than good. Give me 6 months and Vail Industries will run smoother than it has in years. You'll wonder why you didn't do this sooner." "When can you start?" 2 weeks. I need to finish things at my current company properly. Professional courtesy." They shook hands, worked out the details with HR and legal, and by Friday afternoon, Adrian had restructured his entire professional life in a way that would have seemed impossible a month ago. He called Clara from his office, suddenly nervous in a way that had nothing to do with corporate politics. "It's done," he said when she answered. "I hired a COO, finalized the transition plan with the board. Starting next month, my schedule is actually going to be manageable." "How do you feel?" "Terrified. Relieved. Uncertain whether I just made the best or worst decision of my career." He paused. "Want to get dinner tonight? Celebrate or commiserate, depending on how this all works out." "I can't tonight. I'm covering someone's shift until closing." Clara's voice softened. "But I'm off tomorrow, all day. No scheduling conflicts, no obligations. We could do something, properly, without your phone interrupting every 20 minutes. What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet. Something normal. Something that people in regular relationships do without it being a logistical nightmare." "I like the sound of that." They decided on brunch and bookstores, the kind of simple plan that shouldn't have felt revolutionary but did. Adrian spent the next 24 hours trying not to overthink it, mostly failing, definitely checking his phone too often to see if Clara had texted. She hadn't, which probably meant she was being healthy about this whole thing while he spiraled. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Adrian met Clara at a cafe in the West Village, not the bookstore from their first date, but a new place neither of them had associations with yet. She was already there when he arrived, reading something on her phone and drinking coffee that had probably gone cold while she was distracted. "Hi," Adrian said, sliding into the seat across from her. Clara looked up and smiled, and Adrian felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for weeks. "Hi yourself, you look different." "Different how?" "Less like you're about to have a heart attack from stress. It's a good look on you." They ordered food that took forever to arrive. The place was slammed with weekend brunch crowds, and talked about nothing important.
Clara told him about a customer who'd proposed to his girlfriend at the cafe counter that morning, which had been sweet but also incredibly awkward for everyone else waiting for coffee. Adrian told her about Oliver's recent discovery of knock-knock jokes, most of which made no sense but were hilarious anyway. "He told me one this morning," Adrian said. "Knock-knock. Who's there? Banana. Banana who? Banana space rocket." "That's not how knock-knock jokes work." I tried to explain that. He insisted I didn't understand comedy. He's probably right. The food finally arrived. Elaborate egg dishes and toast that cost too much but tasted good enough to justify it. They ate slowly, not rushing toward the next thing because, for once, there wasn't a next thing demanding their attention. Around them, the cafe buzzed with conversations and clinking dishes and the specific energy of Saturday morning in Manhattan. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said eventually, pushing her half-finished plate aside.
Sure. Are you happy? With the changes, with how things are going, with all of it? Adrian considered the question honestly. "I'm not sure yet. Ask me in 6 months when I've actually figured out how to not micromanage everything. But I feel better than I have in years, so that's probably a good sign." "Good." Clara reached across the table, took his hand. "Because I need you to be doing this for yourself, not for me. I can handle being the catalyst, but I can't handle being the reason."
"I know, and you're not."
"You're just the person who made me realize I was allowed to want something different."
They spent the rest of the day exactly as planned, wandering through bookstores, reading passages to each other, arguing about poetry and whether experimental fiction was brave or pretentious. At some point, the conversation drifted to more serious territory, to what came next for both of them, to the question of whether they were building towards something or just enjoying the moment.
"I want to meet Oliver," Clara said suddenly. They were in the poetry section of the third bookstore, surrounded by verses about love and loss and everything in between. "Not today. I'm not ready for that today. But eventually. If this is going somewhere, I should meet him." Adrian felt his throat tighten. "Are you sure?" "No. I'm terrified, actually."
What if he hates me? What if I'm terrible with kids? What if I say something wrong and mess him up for life?
"He won't hate you, and you won't mess him up. He's pretty resilient." "When you're ready, then. No rush, just eventually." "Eventually sounds good." They left the bookstore as evening started settling in, the city shifting into its nighttime rhythm. Clara suggested they walk instead of taking the subway, and Adrian agreed despite the distance. They moved through Manhattan holding hands, not talking much, just existing together in a way that felt comfortable instead of complicated. At some point it started raining, light at first, then heavier, the kind of rain that soaked through clothes and made everything smell like wet pavement. They should have ducked into a building or hailed a cab, but instead they kept walking, laughing at the absurdity of it, letting the rain turn them into drowned versions of themselves. "This is ridiculous," Clara shouted over the downpour. "Completely ridiculous," Adrian agreed. "We should find shelter." Probably, but neither of them stopped walking, and by the time they finally did find a bodega awning to huddle under, they were both soaked through and grinning like idiots. Clara's hair hung in wet strands around her face. Adrian's expensive shirt was plastered to his chest. They looked at each other and started laughing, the kind of laughter that came from relief and joy and the specific absurdity of choosing to stay in the rain when shelter was available. "We're disasters," Clara said when she could breathe again. "The best kind of disasters." She kissed him then, rain-soaked and shivering, and Adrian thought that maybe this was what happiness felt like when you weren't trying to schedule it or control it or make it fit into the narrow parameters of a life that didn't have room for spontaneity. Maybe happiness was just this, standing under a bodega awning in the rain with someone who saw all your mess and chose you anyway. "I love you," Adrian said before he could stop himself. Clara pulled back slightly, eyes wide. "What?" "I love you. I probably shouldn't say that yet. It's too soon, too much pressure, too—" "I love you too," Clara interrupted, which is terrifying and probably stupid but apparently true anyway. They stood there in the rain, dripping and ridiculous and in love, while around them New York continued its relentless motion. Nothing was solved. All their complications still existed. Adrian still had a company to manage and a son to raise. Clara still had a cafe job and writing dreams and a fifth-floor walk-up. But for the first time since they'd met, none of that felt insurmountable. It just felt like life. Messy,
complicated, beautiful life that they were choosing to build together despite all the very good reasons not to. And that was enough. The rain had stopped by the time they made it back to Adrian's apartment, but they were still dripping water across his marble floors when Maria opened the door and took one look at them before bursting into laughter. "You both look like drowned cats," she said, already moving toward the linen closet for towels. "Oliver's asleep, thank goodness. He'd have a million questions about why grown adults don't know to come inside when it rains." "We knew," Clara said, accepting a towel and wrapping it around her shoulders. "We just didn't care." Maria's expression softened as she looked between them, and Adrian saw the exact moment she understood what had shifted. "I'll make tea. You two should change before you catch pneumonia, and I have to explain to a 6-year-old why his father is sick from being romantic." Adrian led Clara to his bedroom, gave her one of his shirts and a pair of sweatpants that would be too big, but at least dry. She changed in the bathroom while he changed in the bedroom, both of them moving with the careful awareness of people who'd said, "I love you" in the rain, and were now trying to figure out what that meant in practical terms. When Clara emerged, swimming in his clothes, hair still damp and falling around her shoulders, Adrian felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with the specific intimacy of seeing someone comfortable in your space. "This is weird," Clara said, tugging at the oversized shirt. "Good weird, but weird. We can be weird together." They joined Maria in the kitchen, where she'd made tea and was pretending not to study them with the keen interest of someone who'd been watching Adrian navigate single fatherhood for 4 years and was cautiously optimistic about this development. "So," Maria said, sliding cups toward them, "are you two going to tell me what happened, or am I supposed to pretend I don't notice you both looking like you just figured out something important?" Adrian glanced at Clara, who shrugged. "Your call." He took a breath. "I told her I loved her. She said it back. We're apparently doing this for real." "It's about time," Maria said, with the casual certainty of someone who'd seen this coming from the beginning. "When does she meet Oliver?" "We haven't discussed that yet," Clara said quickly. "It's probably too soon. It's exactly the right time. Any later, and you risk him feeling like you've been hiding things from him. Any earlier, and it would have been before you both knew this was serious." Maria sipped her tea. "Tomorrow's Sunday. Oliver has a soccer thing in the morning, but the afternoon is free. You could come for lunch. Nothing formal, just see how it goes." Adrian watched Clara's face cycle through panic and consideration. "That's fast," he said, giving her an out if she wanted it. "Fast is probably better than overthinking it until I convince myself I'll be terrible at this." Clara turned to Maria. "What if he hates me?" "He won't. He's 6. His criteria for liking people is whether they're willing to talk about space and laugh at his jokes." Maria stood, rinsed her cup in the sink. "But if you need more time, take it. Adrian's waited 4 years to introduce someone to his son. He can wait a little longer." Clara looked at Adrian, something vulnerable in her expression. "What do you think?" "I think Maria's right that there's never going to be a perfect time, but I also think you should only do this if you feel ready. There's no pressure." "That's a lie. There's tons of pressure. Meeting your boyfriend's kid is basically the most pressure that exists in a relationship." But Clara was smiling slightly when she said it. "Okay, tomorrow, lunch. I'll try not to completely mess it up." "You won't mess it up," Maria said with confidence that Adrian wished he shared. "Just be yourself. Kids can tell when adults are performing, and they hate it." After Maria left, Adrian and Clara sat together on the couch with their tea, both suddenly quiet as the reality of tomorrow settled over them. Outside, the city had gone quiet in that specific post-rain way, everything washed clean and temporarily peaceful. "I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "What if I say something wrong? What if he asks about his mom and I don't know how to answer? What if I'm just fundamentally not good with children?" "Then we'll figure it out, together." Adrian took her hand. "Oliver's pretty straightforward. If he doesn't like something, he'll tell you, usually loudly, but he's also more resilient than I give him credit for. He can handle meeting someone important to me." "Important," Clara repeated softly. "That's a lot of weight for one word." "It's true, though. You're important to me. He should know that." They talked until past midnight, Claire asking questions about Oliver's routines and interests and what topics to avoid, Adrian trying to reassure her while also being honest about the challenges. His son was smart, curious, occasionally difficult, and still processing his mother's death in ways that showed up at unexpected moments. There was no manual for introducing a new person into that equation. What did you tell him about his mom? Clara asked. The truth, as much as he could understand at 6. That she died in an accident, that it wasn't anyone's fault, that she loved him more than anything, that sometimes terrible things happen and we have to find ways to keep living anyway. Adrian's voice caught slightly. He asks about her sometimes, usually when I least expect it. I never know if I'm handling it right. I don't think there is a right way to handle something like that. Probably not. But I keep trying anyway. Clara stayed over that night, sleeping in Adrian's guest room despite the obvious invitation to stay in his. She wanted Oliver's first impression to be appropriate, not confusing, and Adrian appreciated that even as he lay awake in his own bed, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake by moving this fast. Morning arrived too quickly. Oliver bounded into Adrian's room at 7:30, apparently operating on some internal alarm clock that didn't recognize weekends. He launched himself onto the bed with the grace of a small tornado. Daddy, it's soccer day. We have to go soon or we'll be late. We have 3 hours, buddy. We won't be late. But what if there's traffic or a dinosaur attack or... Oliver stopped mid-sentence, his attention caught by something through the open door. Why is there a lady in the hallway? Adrian's stomach dropped. He sat up to see Clara standing outside the guest room, clearly having been woken by Oliver's enthusiastic entrance. She wore the same borrowed clothes from last night and looked absolutely panicked. That's Clara, Adrian said, keeping his voice casual. She's my friend. She came over last night and it got late, so she stayed in the guest room. Oliver studied Clara with the intense scrutiny only children could manage. Do you like space? Clara blinked, clearly not expecting that to be the first question. Yes? I think space is interesting. Do you know what a black hole is? It's a place where gravity is so strong that nothing can escape, not even light. Oliver's eyes widened. Daddy, she knows about black holes. Can she come to my soccer game? Adrian looked at Clara, whose expression had shifted from panic to something like cautious hope. Do you want to come to a soccer game for 6-year-olds? Fair warning, it's mostly chaos and very little actual soccer. I would love to come to a soccer game for 6-year-olds. Okay, Oliver jumped off the bed, already moving at top speed toward his room. I have to find my cleats and my jersey and tell everyone my dad's friend knows about black holes. He disappeared down the hallway, leaving Adrian and Clara staring at each other in the sudden quiet. Well, Clara said, that went better than expected. Give it time. The day is young. The soccer game was exactly as chaotic as promised. 12 6-year-olds running in approximate directions, occasionally near the ball, mostly just enjoying the opportunity to run and shout. Oliver played with enthusiastic incompetence, and every time he touched the ball, he looked over to make sure Adrian and Clara were watching. Clara surprised Adrian by getting genuinely invested in the game, cheering when Oliver's team scored and groaning when they gave up a goal. She didn't try to be perfect or perform some idealized version of what a potential stepmother should look like. She just sat on the sideline bleachers drinking terrible coffee from the concession stand and enjoying watching children play soccer badly. Your kid is terrible at this, Clara said affectionately as Oliver tripped over the ball for the 3rd time. He really is. But he loves it, so we keep coming back. That's good parenting, letting him be terrible at things he enjoys instead of pushing him toward things he's good at but hates. You think so? I know so. My parents spent my entire childhood trying to make me good at practical things when all I wanted was to read and write stories. Look how that turned out. After the game, they went back to Adrian's apartment for lunch. Oliver talked non-stop about the game, specifically about a goal he almost scored but didn't, while Clara listened with what seemed like genuine interest. Adrian watched them interact with cautious optimism, looking for red flags or signs that this was going to be a disaster. Instead, he found his son showing Clara his collection of space books, explaining the difference between planets and dwarf planets with the seriousness of a university professor. Clara asked questions that weren't condescending, shared facts she knew that Oliver didn't, and admitted when she didn't know something instead of pretending. I like her, Oliver announced at one point, as if Clara wasn't sitting right there. She's smart, and she doesn't talk to me like I'm a baby. I'm glad you like her, buddy. Is she your girlfriend? The question hung in the air. Adrian looked at Clara, who gave a small nod. Your call. Yes, Adrian said.
She's my girlfriend. Oliver considered this with the gravity of a federal judge. Okay, but she can't have my room. I need it for my stuff. Nobody's taking your room. Good, because I have a lot of stuff. Oliver turned back to Clara. Do you want to see my telescope? Daddy got me one for my birthday, and I can see the moon and sometimes Jupiter if it's not cloudy. I would love to see your telescope. They spent the afternoon in Oliver's room while Adrian tried to get work done and failed completely. Too distracted by the sounds of his son and Clara discussing constellations and whether aliens might exist. At one point, he heard Oliver say something about his mom, and he tensed, waiting for the conversation to go wrong. My mommy died when I was little, Oliver said matter-of-factly. I don't remember her much, but Daddy says she was really nice and loved me a lot. She sounds like she was a wonderful person, Clara replied, her voice gentle. You're lucky you had her. Even if it wasn't for as long as you wanted. Daddy says the same thing. He gets sad sometimes when he thinks about her, but he says it's okay to be sad about people we love. Your daddy's right. Being sad means we cared about someone, and that's a good thing even when it hurts. Adrian felt his throat tighten. He'd been so worried about how Clara would handle these conversations, but she was navigating them with more grace than he'd managed most days. Evening came too quickly. Clara had an early shift the next morning and needed to get home, get sleep, prepare for another week of making coffee for people who barely noticed her. Oliver protested her leaving, demanding promises that she'd come back soon, that she'd help him with his space project for school, that she'd explain more about black holes. I promise, Clara said, crouching down to his level, but you have to promise me something too. What? That you'll be patient with me. I've never spent much time with kids before, so I'm probably going to mess up sometimes. But I'm trying, okay? Oliver threw his arms around her in a hug that nearly knocked her over. Okay, but you're not bad at kids. You're actually pretty good. Claire's eyes were wet when she pulled back, though she tried to hide it. Thank you. That means a lot. Adrian walked her down to the street, both of them quiet as they waited for her rideshare to arrive. The evening had shifted into that golden hour when the light made everything look softer, more forgiving. He liked you, Adrian said. He's a good kid. You're doing something right with him. We're doing something right. You were amazing today. I was terrified today, but I'm glad I came. Clara turned to face him fully. This is real now, isn't it? Not just us figuring things out, but actually building something that includes Oliver. Is that okay? It's scary, but yes, it's okay. Her rideshare pulled up, and she grabbed Adrian's hand. I need to tell you something. Okay. I gave notice at the cafe. Adrian felt his heart stop. What? 2 weeks' notice. I'm quitting. Clara said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. I've been thinking about it for a while, and today just confirmed that I need to make a change. I can't keep telling myself I'm a writer while spending 60 hours a week making coffee. Something has to give. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Maybe freelance editing while I actually finish my novel. Maybe find a different job that doesn't eat my entire life. Maybe fail spectacularly and end up back at another cafe in 6 months. She squeezed his hand. But I need to try. You restructured your entire career to make space for the things that actually matter. I should do the same. That's terrifying. Completely terrifying, but also necessary. Clara kissed him quickly. I'll text you later. Thank Oliver for me. Tell him I'll help with his space project. She got in the car and Adrian watched it pull away, feeling like they'd crossed another threshold they couldn't uncross. Clara was leaving her job, which meant no steady income, no health insurance, no safety net beyond whatever savings she'd managed to scrape together. It was reckless and brave, and exactly the kind of leap Adrian had been too afraid to take until she'd shown him it was possible. The next 2 weeks moved in fast forward. Elena started at Vale Industries and immediately began reorganizing systems that Adrian had been managing poorly for years. She was efficient, ruthless when necessary, and completely unintimidated by Adrian's tendency to second-guess decisions. Within days, his schedule had transformed from impossible to merely demanding. Stop checking my work, Elena said during their 3rd week together, catching him reviewing a contract she'd already approved. You hired me to do this. Let me do it. What if you miss something? Then we fix it. But you hovering doesn't prevent mistakes. It just slows everything down and makes you insufferable to work with. She pulled the contract out of his hands. Go home. Spend time with your kid.
Live the life you restructured everything to have. Trust me to handle this. Adrian went home. It felt wrong at first, leaving the office at 5 instead of 8 or 9 or midnight. But Oliver was thrilled to have him around for dinner, for homework help, for the mundane evening routines that Adrian had been missing while building an empire. "You're home a lot now," Oliver observed one evening while they played a board game that made no sense, but Oliver insisted was fun. "Did you get fired?" "No, buddy. I just decided work isn't the most important thing in my life."
"What is?" "You are. And being present for you instead of just being in the same room while my mind is somewhere else." Oliver moved his game piece, incorrectly, but Adrian didn't correct him. "Is Clara important too?" "Yes, she's very important." "Are you going to marry her?" The question caught Adrian off guard. "I don't know, maybe someday. Why?"
"Because Marcus at school's dad got married again, and now Marcus has 2 houses and gets twice as many Christmas presents. I think that would be good." Adrian laughed despite himself. "I don't think that's how it works." "It should be." Clara finished her last shift at Corner Grind on a Thursday afternoon, and Adrian showed up to mark the occasion. The cafe was busy, but Jake had insisted on making her a farewell drink, something ridiculous with foam art that was supposed to be a book but looked more like a blob. "I'm free," Clara said, untying her apron for the last time. "Unemployed and terrified, but free. How does it feel? Ask me in 6 months when I've either finished my novel or realized I've made a catastrophic mistake." They celebrated that night with dinner at a restaurant neither of them could really afford. Clara's insistence that she pay her share, Adrian's agreement even though it hurt his wallet less than hers. Over wine that was better than they needed, and pasta that was exactly as good as the price suggested, they talked about what came next. "I've been thinking," Clara said, twirling pasta on her fork, "about the bookstore cafe idea we talked about once, the one you offered to help with, and I got defensive and refused." "I remember. I still don't want your money, but I've been doing research, and there's a small business grant program for women starting creative ventures in Brooklyn. The application deadline is next month." "Are you going to apply?" "I think so. It's a long shot, hundreds of applications for maybe 10 grants. But the worst they can say is no, and I'm getting used to hearing no." She met his eyes. "If I get it, though, if I actually get funding, would you help me figure out the business side? Not financially, just advice. You've built an entire company. You know how this stuff works." "Of course I'll help, whatever you need. Just advice. I need to build this myself or it won't mean anything." "I understand." Clara submitted her application on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at Adrian's dining room table while Oliver did homework beside her and Adrian reviewed financial reports that Elena had insisted he still needed to see quarterly. It felt remarkably domestic, the 3 of them existing in the same space while doing completely different things. "Done," Clara announced, hitting submit with a flourish. "Now I wait 6 weeks to find out if I'm wasting my time or actually onto something." "You're onto something," Oliver said without looking up from his math homework. "Your bookstore idea is good. Better than Daddy's buildings." "Hey," Adrian protested. "My buildings are important. They're boring. Books are better." Clara laughed, and Adrian felt something warm settle in his chest at the sound. This was what he'd been restructuring his life for. Not grand gestures or dramatic changes, but quiet evenings where the people he loved existed together without needing anything to be perfect. The weeks passed in a new rhythm. Adrian worked reasonable hours, came home for dinner most nights, actually took weekends off to spend with Oliver and Clara. Elena ran Vale Industries with terrifying competence, calling him only when decisions needed his specific input. Clara wrote every morning, edited freelance projects in the afternoons to pay rent, and slowly built a life that looked less like survival and more like choice. They fought sometimes, usually about stupid things that masked deeper fears. Adrian struggled with not controlling every aspect of his company and occasionally took that frustration out on Clara. Clara struggled with feeling like she was falling behind while everyone else succeeded and sometimes pushed Adrian away when he tried to help. But they worked through it, learning to recognize their patterns and interrupt them before they escalated. "I'm being defensive again," Clara said during one argument about whether Adrian could introduce her to a publisher he knew. "I know you're trying to help, but it feels like you think I can't do this on my own." "I don't think that at all. I think you're incredibly capable and talented. I just want to make your path easier if I can." "I know, but easy isn't always better. Sometimes the struggle is what makes it mean something. Adrian thought about that, about his own journey with Vale Industries and how much the difficulty had shaped him. You're right. I'm sorry for trying to fix things that don't need fixing. And I'm sorry for being too proud to accept help when it's actually useful. Clara moved closer to him. We're both still figuring this out. We are, but we're figuring it out together, which seems important. The grant notification came on a gray Wednesday in March, 6 weeks and 3 days after Clara had submitted her application. Adrian was in a meeting with Elena when his phone buzzed with a text from Clara that was just a string of incomprehensible letters and exclamation points. He excused himself, called her back. What happened? I got it. Her voice was shaking. The grant. I actually got it. $50,000 to start a bookstore cafe in Brooklyn. Clara, that's incredible. I don't know what to do. I know what to do. Find a location, write a business plan, figure out licensing and permits and all of that. But I don't know how to do any of those things. Panic was starting to creep into her voice. What if I screw this up? What if I take this money and waste it because I have no idea what I'm doing? Then you'll learn. And I'll help you figure it out if you want. Not by doing it for you, just by being there while you do it.
Can you get...
You come over? I'm kind of freaking out. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He found her in her Crown Heights apartment, surrounded by printed articles about small business ownership and looking completely overwhelmed. Adrian sat beside her on the floor, sorting through the chaos while she explained her vision. A space that felt like a living room, with books you could buy and coffee you could actually afford, where writers could work and readers could linger, and community could happen naturally. It's ambitious, Adrian said after listening to her describe everything she wanted to create. Too ambitious? No, the right amount of ambitious. He pulled out his phone, started making notes. Okay, first step is finding a location. You need something in Brooklyn, probably Prospect Heights or Crown Heights based on your budget. Enough space for seating and shelves, good foot traffic, but not so expensive that rent eats all your profits. They spent the next 3 hours planning, Adrian asking questions that made Clara think through details she hadn't considered, Clara pushing back when his suggestions felt too corporate and not aligned with her vision. By the time they finished, Clara had a rough timeline and a list of next steps that felt manageable instead of impossible. Thank you, she said when Adrian finally had to leave for Oliver's school pickup, for helping without taking over. That's harder than it sounds. I'm learning. Slowly, but learning. Finding the right location took 6 weeks and involved looking at 17 different spaces that ranged from perfect but unaffordable to affordable but terrible. Clara nearly gave up twice, convinced that her vision was unrealistic and she should just put the grant money in savings and go back to making coffee for someone else. There has to be something, Adrian said after another disappointing viewing. The right space exists. We just haven't found it yet. Maybe this is the universe telling me I'm not ready. Or maybe this is the universe testing whether you actually want it enough to keep looking. The space they finally found was in Prospect Heights, tucked on a side street between a vintage clothing store and a yoga studio. It had been a used bookstore that closed during the pandemic, and the owner was willing to lease it cheap to someone who'd keep the original shelves and maintain the literary character of the space. Clara walked through it with tears in her eyes, running her hands over shelves that smelled like old paper and possibility. This is it. This is exactly what I imagined. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. The next 3 months were chaos. Permits and inspections, renovations that revealed problems that required more renovations, equipment purchases and inventory decisions, and the thousand small details that transformed an empty space into something real. Clara worked 18-hour days, managing contractors and learning to make espresso properly and cataloging books donated by people who believed in what she was building. Adrian helped where he could, offering advice on business structures and financing, introducing her to his accountant, showing up with Oliver on weekends to paint walls and assemble furniture. But mostly he watched Clara build something from nothing with her own determination and vision, refusing shortcuts that would compromise what she was creating. I'm exhausted, Clara admitted one night, collapsed on Adrian's couch while Oliver showed her pictures he'd drawn of her future bookstore. I haven't written in weeks. I'm spending every penny I have on this.
I'm terrified it's going to fail. It's not going to fail. You don't know that.
You're right, I don't. But I know you, and I know when you commit to something, you don't quit halfway.
Adrian sat beside her.
Remember the first night we met? You were so convinced you didn't belong at that wedding that you were just pretending to fit in someone else's world. I was right about that. Maybe. But you're not pretending anymore. You're building your own world now, and it's better than anything you could have fit into. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder.
When did you become so wise?
I'm not wise, I'm just finally learning to recognize what actually matters. The bookstore opened on a Saturday in June, 6 months after Clara had quit her cafe job, and 4 months after she'd signed the lease on her impossible dream. They decided to call it Margins, a name that referenced both the physical margins of pages and the idea of living in the margins of society, building community in the spaces between mainstream success. The opening was small and perfect. No big advertising campaign, just word of mouth and a few flyers in local coffee shops. But people came. Writers Clara knew from readings and workshops. Regular customers from Corner Grind who'd followed her to this new venture. Neighbors who were curious about the new spot on their street. Adrian and Oliver, who'd helped set up that morning and stayed all day watching Clara work.
Look at all these people, Oliver whispered to Adrian, watching Clara help a customer find a specific poetry collection.
Clara made this happen.
She did? That's pretty cool. Like when you build buildings, but with books instead.
Yeah, buddy, exactly like that. Clara caught Adrian's eye from across the store, smiled in a way that made his chest tight. She was covered in coffee stains and looked exhausted and completely happy in a way he'd never seen before. This was what success looked like when it was built on your own terms. Messy, imperfect, exactly right. That evening, after the last customer left and Oliver had fallen asleep on the reading room couch, Adrian helped Clara clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, wiping down tables and restocking shelves, putting the space back together for tomorrow. I can't believe this is real, Clara said, looking around at what she'd created. 6 months ago, I was making coffee for people who didn't see me. Now I have this. You built this. Not luck, not help, not anything except your own determination. That's not entirely true. You helped. Oliver helped. Dozens of people helped. She turned to face him. I couldn't have done this alone. Maybe not, but you could have. That's the difference. You didn't need anyone to save you. You just needed people to believe in you while you saved yourself. Clara walked over to where Adrian stood by the window, looking out at the Prospect Heights evening. I have something to tell you. Okay? I finished it, my novel. While I was building this place and learning to run a business and figuring out my life, I finished the thing I've been trying to write for 3 years. Clara, that's amazing. I don't know if it's any good, but it's done, and it's honest, and it's mine. She took a breath. I wanted you to be the first to know. Adrian pulled her close, feeling the weight of everything they'd both built in the past 6 months. Not just businesses and spaces, but trust and partnership and the specific courage required to let someone see you completely. I'm proud of you, so incredibly proud. I'm proud of you too. You restructured your entire life and didn't implode. That's pretty impressive. We're both pretty impressive when you think about it. They stood together in the bookstore Clara had built while Oliver slept on the couch, and outside the city continued its endless motion. Nothing was perfect. Clara's business was barely breaking even and might not survive the year. Adrian still struggled with letting go of control at Vail Industries. Oliver still had hard days when he missed his mother, and no amount of love from Adrian or Clara could fix that. But they'd built something real anyway. Not despite the imperfection, but because of it. Because they'd both stopped waiting for their lives to be ready for happiness and started building it with whatever materials they had available. 2 months later, Clara's novel sold to a small independent publisher who loved its raw honesty and refusal to provide easy answers. The advance wasn't life-changing, but it was real. Validation that her work mattered, that she'd been right to keep trying even when everything suggested she should quit. 3 months after that, Adrian proposed, not with elaborate planning or dramatic gestures, but on a regular Tuesday evening while they were helping Oliver with a school project about the solar system. Clara said yes with coffee-stained hands and happy tears, and Oliver immediately started planning a wedding that involved way too many space references and a ring-bearer outfit for himself that looked suspiciously like an astronaut suit. They got married the following spring in a small ceremony at Margins, surrounded by books and friends and the community Clara had built from nothing. Oliver did wear the astronaut outfit, and Adrian's board members looked deeply uncomfortable, surrounded by so many writers and artists. But none of that mattered, because Clara and Adrian had stopped trying to fit into worlds that weren't built for them, and started creating one that was. The vows they wrote weren't about perfect love or fairy tale endings. They were about choosing each other despite complications, about building something honest instead of something easy, about the specific courage required to be vulnerable with another person and trust they won't weaponize that vulnerability. I promise to keep showing up, Adrian said, holding Clara's hands in front of everyone they loved. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but consistently. To prioritize you not because you need saving, but because you deserve to be prioritized. To let you build your own life while being grateful I get to exist in it.
I promise to let you in, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears. To fight my instinct to protect myself by pushing you away. To believe that wanting you doesn't make me weak. To build a life that's ours, not mine or yours, but something we create together that's better than what either of us could make alone. They kissed while Oliver cheered and someone's phone rang with a work emergency that Adrian ignored completely because some things were actually more important than business crises. Later, during the reception that was more book launch than traditional wedding, Clara pulled Adrian aside and said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Thank you for seeing me that night at the wedding, for helping when you didn't have to, for staying when it got complicated. Thank you for grabbing my arm and asking me to pretend I knew you, for showing me that success without connection is just expensive loneliness, for teaching me that vulnerability isn't weakness. They rejoined the party, their party, in Clara's bookstore, surrounded by the life they'd both fought so hard to build. Adrian caught Elena's eye from across the room, saw her nod with approval that meant Vale Industries was fine without him hovering. He caught Maria's smile as she danced with Oliver, both of them laughing at nothing in particular. This was what happiness looked like when you stopped performing it and started living it, messy and perfect, full of people who loved you not despite your flaws, but because they were part of who you actually were. Clara had been right that first night when she'd said they were both pretty pathetic, searching for exits in a ballroom full of people who didn't see them. But she'd been wrong about it being permanent. Sometimes pathetic people found each other and built something that transformed them both. Not into perfect versions of themselves, but into people brave enough to be imperfect together. And that was better than any fairy tale ending could ever be. Because fairy tales didn't include coffee stains and business struggles and late-night arguments about whose turn it was to handle Oliver's math homework. They didn't include the hard work of choosing someone every single day, especially on days when walking away seemed easier. They didn't include the specific beauty of being seen completely, flaws and fears and failures included, and chosen anyway. But real life did. Real life, built by two people who'd been lost in their own ways until they found each other in a Manhattan ballroom and decided to stop pretending long enough to be honest. Real life, where love wasn't rescue, but partnership, where success wasn't perfection, but presence, where happiness wasn't something you waited for, but something you built with your own imperfect hands. Adrian looked at Clara across the bookstore she'd created, at Oliver showing off his astronaut outfit to anyone who would pay attention, at the community gathered to celebrate two people who'd had the courage to choose vulnerability over protection. And he understood that the best decision he'd ever made wasn't building Vale Industries or restructuring his career or any of the things that looked impressive on paper. It was saying yes to a scared woman in a navy dress who'd asked him to pretend he knew her, then spending every day since proving that the pretending had become real. That was worth more than any empire he could ever build. And he'd spend the rest of his life grateful that he'd been standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, when Clara's courage collided with his loneliness, and created something neither of them could have imagined alone. Sometimes the best stories started with desperate lies and transformed into honest truths. Sometimes love was less about finding someone perfect and more about finding someone willing to be imperfect with you. Sometimes success meant giving up everything you thought mattered to make room for the things that actually did. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, a moment of panic in a ballroom could change the entire trajectory of your life. Not because it was planned or perfect, but because two people decided to be brave enough to stop protecting themselves long enough to be seen. That was the story Adrian would tell Oliver someday, when his son was old enough to understand. Not a fairy tale about love conquering all,
but a human story about two people who fought their own fears and each other and the world's expectations to build something real. And in the end, that was the only kind of story worth telling.